Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Curiosity Dude. Today, we're diving deep into the adventures of the human body before humanity even graced the Earth. For millions of years, this intricate evolution was anything but straightforward. Prepare to embark on an epic journey through time as we explore the fascinating twists and turns that set the stage for the most sophisticated organism on the planet, you. So, hit that subscribe button and let's unravel the mysteries of our ancient origins together. And now, let me tell you a little bit about the broader context of our history. I'm not just talking about skin and hair here, because for our skin to change color, for our hair to evolve, these things needed to come into existence in the first place as natural phenomena. Our bodies are the result of countless events that unfolded throughout the long history of our planet, often for the most unpredictable reasons. That is, definitely not for the purposes they serve us now. We all know it all started with the Big Bang, but I won't delve into that because, honestly, I don't know much about it myself. So, I'll start from the time when the so-called primordial soup came into being. Of course, primordial soup needs a bit of explanation. It's essentially the state of water and various substances on planet Earth about 4.5 billion years ago. It contained all sorts of dissolved chemicals: phosphorus, fluorine, copper, iron, hydrogen, carbon, and so on. With the right temperature, acidity, and bombarded by cosmic rays, and occasionally meteorites, the whole mix started to cook itself. Somewhere in this primordial soup, in the early Archean era, around 4.5 billion years ago, life appeared. How exactly it happened is still a big question. The process of biogenesis is actively studied now, but many smart folks have proposed various theories on how life might have emerged. Darwin suggested it might have started in a warm little pond, and despite this idea being an early one, it remains a plausible hypothesis. Some suggest it could have begun in deep-sea hydrothermal vents, where volcanic activity spewed out all sorts of chemicals. But there are questions about whether deep-sea vents even existed 4.5 billion years ago because it's not certain there was enough water on Earth back then. Where did all the water come from? Was it degassed from Earth's mantle, or did it come from a comet that crashed and melted, forming the oceans? Other theories suggest it could have been in alkaline hydrothermal vents, where minerals formed tiny porous structures that got coated with organic materials, creating cell-like structures. The solution inside these structures could be seen as a primitive form of cytoplasm. And from here, it was just a matter of getting something alive to form. Maybe it was aluminosilicate clay, which might please religious folks since the idea of life forming from clay is present in various traditions. I mean, the Sumerians thought so, and the Bible picked up on it. It could have been a mud volcano, which is kind of the same idea but with more bubbling and heat. These hydrothermal vents or geysers, often hot and active, are known to encourage reactions, much like cooking food is more effective when it's boiled, rather than left raw. The hypothesis of life forming in fumaroles is also intriguing. Fumaroles are essentially underground geysers, shielded from the harsh UV radiation that, for 0.5 billion years ago, would have destroyed emerging life before it had a chance to get started. Scientists have come up with more ideas for how life could have begun than there are actual instances of life. This is fascinating because while genetic coding is essentially the same across all organisms, implying life began once, it suggests the planet was uniquely primed for this one-off event. Life likely emerged several times and continues to form in tiny warm ponds, geysers, or fumaroles even now, but the existing bacteria quickly consume any new organic material. So, while the odds of new life forming are slim, they're not zero. Eventually, RNA appeared as the first self-replicating molecule. Then came DNA, which is more stable because it's double-stranded and better protected. With time, cellular structures emerged, cell membranes and cytoplasm formed, bringing together nucleotides, which store information, proteins, coded by nucleotides, and lipid membranes, encasing it all. Voila cell. And thus, the building blocks of life were born. The conditions of those early environments, like acidity and mineral content, set the stage. Had our planet been different, life might not have formed at all, or it might have looked vastly different. Absolutely, many of our basic properties were shaped by the early conditions of the Archean Earth, which were quite different from today. Our current problems often stem from changes in these conditions over time. This change was good in a way because, without it, those early organisms wouldn't have evolved and adapted as they did. During the Archean and Proterozoic eons, eukaryotes, nucleus-containing organisms, emerged, capable of forming little compartments inside themselves. These compartments allowed different reactions to occur without interfering with each other, unlike prokaryotes, bacteria, which usually can only perform one type of reaction at a time. Eukaryotes needed more DNA, which required energy. This energy came from mitochondria, which were once independent bacteria that got incorporated into eukaryotes. These mitochondria use oxygen, initially a toxic waste product from early anaerobic bacteria, but later repurposed for energy production. Ancient bacteria formed layers called stromatolites. The top layer consisted of photosynthetic bacteria, which got energy from sunlight and expelled waste products. The middle layer also sometimes contained photosynthetic bacteria, utilizing the energy passing through from the top layer. The bottom layer contained bacteria that couldn't perform photosynthesis, surviving on the scant energy left over. These early bacteria produced oxygen as a waste product, which was toxic to them. To cope, they incorporated mitochondria, which used this oxygen, turning a problem into a solution by harnessing oxygen for energy, a huge evolutionary win. To see how much energy oxygen can produce, just try burning something, carefully and not right now, of course. You'll feel the immense energy output from oxidation. So, the real challenge is figuring out how to regulate all that energy. Using it efficiently allows for the development of complex, multicellular organisms with large genomes, coding for all sorts of specialized cells in a single body. Brain cells, liver cells, left toe cells, they all have the same DNA but use different parts of it. This requires a massive, well-regulated DNA blueprint, something not possible without oxygen and mitochondria. All of this is, of course, an oversimplification. Our understanding, based on fossils and comparisons to modern bacteria, is still pretty limited and hazy. Most of what we know comes from blurry ancient rocks and a lot of educated guesswork. The clearer story begins in the Cambrian period, when large, multicellular organisms capable of synthesizing hard body parts started to appear. These creatures needed lots of oxygen, which had by then been plentifully supplied by earlier life forms. Hard substances, like bones or shells, require a lot of energy to create, hence the importance of oxygen. You can test this by burning something, carefully, not now, seeing just how much energy is released. In the early Cambrian, creatures like trilobites dominated. By the mid-Cambrian, more terrifying predators like anomalocaridids appeared, sort of like giant, wicked shrimp. Later came nautiloids with their long, straight shells, and eurypterids, sea scorpions, with venomous claws. Our ancestors back then were small, vulnerable, and lacking hard exoskeletons. Basically, they were tiny, squishy lancelets. They had one crucial advantage: a notochord, a sort of primitive spine that allowed them to swim quickly and efficiently. It's amazing to think that these early life forms set the stage for all the diversity we see today, adapting and evolving through countless generations. So, in the Ordovician and Silurian periods, the development of a basic skeleton marked a significant evolutionary step. Initially, These skeletons were simple rings of calcium and phosphorus around the notochord. Over time, these structures evolved into cartilage and eventually bone. This internal endoskeleton wasn't much for protection at first, but it provided a crucial advantage: speed. Speed was essential for early vertebrates to outmaneuver predators that were becoming increasingly efficient hunters. Some organisms, such as mollusks and arthropods, opted for an external exoskeleton. This had its benefits, offering substantial protection, but came with drawbacks. An exoskeleton is heavy, limits growth, and makes it challenging to move on land. This is why you don't see giant land-dwelling insects. There's a practical size limit due to their exoskeletons. In contrast, an internal skeleton is lighter, allows for continuous growth, and makes land colonization more feasible. Another monumental leap was the development of the neural tube. In invertebrates, the nervous system is composed of ganglia, which are clusters of nerve cells. These ganglia face a unique challenge. As they grow, the inner cells struggle to get nutrients because the surrounding cells consume most of the available resources. Our chordate ancestors innovated by developing a neural tube with a central cavity filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This allowed for the distribution of nutrients both inside and outside the tube, supporting a larger and more complex nervous system. Initially, the neural tube didn't offer a significant competitive edge, but it laid the groundwork for more sophisticated neural structures. It enabled quicker reflexes and better maneuverability, which were crucial for survival. Detecting predators became vital, and while chemical receptors, chemoreception, were useful, vision offered a tremendous advantage. Eyes evolved independently multiple times across various lineages, enhancing the ability to detect and respond to threats and opportunities in the environment. Our lineage wasn't particularly creative with eye evolution compared to some invertebrates, which developed complex compound eyes. Trilobites, for instance, had eyes made of calcite crystals, a fascinating adaptation. While our ancestors' eyes were simpler, they still provided critical information about the environment, such as the distance to a predator, its speed, shape, and color. The advent of the closed circulatory system was another game-changer. Unlike open systems where blood sloshes around freely, a closed system circulates blood through vessels, allowing for precise delivery of nutrients and oxygen. This system, present in some segmented worms too, was highly efficient. It enabled selective activation of body parts, critical for small, filter-feeding organisms that needed to be energy efficient. Up until the end of the Silurian period, many of these amazing properties were just latent potentials. There were many primitive creatures, but fewer of our direct ancestors, and because they lacked hard skeletal elements, their fossil records are sparse and fragmented. Most of our knowledge comes from rare, well-preserved sites in places like China and Canada. The real turning point came at the end of the Silurian and into the Devonian period. During the Devonian, the planet experienced some of its hottest temperatures ever. The scorching climate made the Devonian one of the hottest periods in Earth's history, far surpassing today's global warming scenarios. This heat, combined with the appearance of vascular plants, changed everything. Plants initially appeared in the Silurian, but it was in the Devonian that they grew larger, moving onto land, creating soil, and stabilizing it with their roots. These roots, though not particularly sturdy, anchored plants, which would occasionally fall back into the water and rot. This process was hindered by the fact that fungi and bacteria capable of decomposing lignin, a component of plant cell walls, hadn't yet evolved, leading to slow decomposition. In warm, shallow waters, oxygen dissolves poorly, much like if you heat mineral water or champagne, the gases escape. The decaying vegetation further depleted oxygen levels, creating anoxic, oxygen-poor conditions. To break down lignin requires a lot of oxygen, and its scarcity made life difficult. Our ancestors, the lobe-finned fish, or Sarcopterygians, faced these challenges head-on. Several lineages of these fish developed lungs as an adaptation to breathe air in these oxygen-poor environments. Lungs evolved from outgrowths of the throat. This adaptation wasn't unique to our ancestors. Modern fish like the walking catfish and lungfish have independently developed similar structures. To complement air breathing, the evolution of the neck became advantageous. This allowed early tetrapods to lift their heads out of the water. There's also a theory that necks evolved for snapping at prey on the water's surface, though typically the mouth just moves upwards in such scenarios. Regardless, the neck provided mobility and an advantage in various environments. Breathing air posed another challenge: how to breathe without ingesting water. Fish have two pairs of nostrils, one pair for intake and the other for outflow. One of these nostrils eventually moved inside the mouth, becoming the choana, or internal nostril. We have intermediate fossil forms showing this transition, where one nostril is positioned among the teeth, eventually leading to the internal configuration we see today. This adaptation allowed these early creatures to stick just the tip of their snouts out of the water, breathe air without gulping water, and use their nostrils for both olfaction and respiration. One big problem for these early fish was that their habitats were often cluttered with fallen trees and debris. Imagine trying to hunt in a messy swamp filled with logs. These fish could grow quite large, up to 1.5 or even 2 meters long, which made navigating these crowded waters difficult. They developed robust, lobe-finned limbs to maneuver over and around the obstacles. Over time, these adaptations turned out to be quite handy for venturing onto land. There were several good reasons to make the move. Shade provided by plants on land helped prevent drying out, and it was often easier to find new food sources or safer places to lay eggs away from aquatic predators. Moving to a new water body could also be strategic for survival and reproduction. It's believed that during this period, the moon was much closer to Earth than it is today, resulting in much stronger tides. These tides could have stranded fish in tidal pools far from the coast, forcing them to adapt to terrestrial life or risk perishing as the water receded. This constant push and pull likely played a significant role in driving evolutionary changes. To survive on land, these early tetrapods developed advanced skin glands. While scales were common among aquatic fish, they evolved to produce mucus for protection. On land, these glands adapted further, leading to the development of sweat glands, sebaceous glands, mammary glands, and more. These glands helped prevent desiccation and offered other advantages, such as thermoregulation and communication through scent. However, these adaptations came with trade-offs. While they enabled life on land, they also meant losing some aquatic abilities. For instance, our ancestors lost the ability to breathe underwater with gills. Occasionally, rare atavisms can cause humans to have small gill-like structures on their necks, but these are not functional gills. Given our energy-hungry brains that require a constant supply of oxygen, even if humans had functional gills, they wouldn't be efficient enough to meet our needs. It's a bit like the myth of the ichthyander from literature. Surgically grafting gills from a young shark onto a human would not make them highly intelligent or efficient. In reality, we'd need a gill surface area the size of a stadium to breathe underwater effectively, which is clearly impractical. As time progressed, we entered the Carboniferous period, an era lush with dense forests that had a significant impact on the planet's environment. Giant ferns and the first seed-bearing plants flourished, reducing the dependency on water and transforming the landscape. Insects, including some gigantic dragonflies with wingspans of up to 70 centimeters and colossal cockroach-like creatures, thrived in these forests. The abundance of plant material led to increased oxygen levels in the atmosphere, benefiting these insects since they breathe through tracheae rather than lungs. Higher oxygen levels meant they could grow larger and become more active. Our amphibian ancestors, the stegocephali, adapted to these changing environments. They developed skin glands to keep their skin moist but still faced the challenge of desiccation, particularly for their eggs, which had delicate, thin membranes that dried out quickly. To solve this, they evolved amniotic eggs with a protective shell. The outer shell provided physical protection, while the amniotic membrane inside prevented desiccation and created a personal aquatic environment for the developing embryo. This adaptation allowed for the transition from water to land, as these eggs could be laid in drier environments without the risk of drying out. The evolution of amniotes marked a significant step forward, enabling these early creatures to fully exploit terrestrial habitats. The Carboniferous period also saw the emergence of early reptiles like Hylonomus, which inhabited the hollow trunks of ancient trees known as Sigillaria. These tree trunks provided shelter and protection, and the bones of these early reptiles have been well preserved in these unique fossil sites. However, this transition came with its challenges. Unlike amphibians, where larval stages, like tadpoles, lived in water and adults on land, amniotes had to face the competition for resources between juveniles and adults. Yet, during the Carboniferous, the abundance of food and lack of large terrestrial predators made this less of an issue. The adaptations of these early reptiles set the stage for further diversification and the eventual dominance of vertebrates on land. With improved respiratory systems, efficient circulatory systems, and protective skin, these creatures were well equipped to conquer new environments. So, here's a funny thing about pioneering new ecological niches in paleontology. Often, when a species is the first to colonize a new niche, it can get away with having some pretty questionable traits. It's like getting a free pass because there's no competition yet. Take amphibians, for example. Their circulatory systems are actually more primitive compared to fish. Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart, but the blood gets mixed before it reaches the brain. Fish, on the other hand, have a more straightforward, oxygen-rich supply. Yet, because amphibians were the first to venture onto land, they managed just fine until reptiles showed up, making life much tougher for them. But then came the Permian period, which was a total game-changer. All the continents smushed together to form Pangaea, messing with equatorial currents. It got pretty bleak, cold, and dry, especially away from the coasts, much like how it feels in some places today. Hello, Winnipeg. During this time, ice ages came and went, making life even harder. Reptiles and amphibians, being cold-blooded, had a rough time. Enter the therapsids, early mammal-like reptiles that developed some nifty tricks to stay warm. They evolved heterodont dentition, meaning they had different types of teeth for different functions: incisors for grabbing, canines for tearing, and molars for chewing. Unlike reptiles, which have uniform teeth that aren't great at processing food, these guys could chow down more efficiently. They also developed cheeks to keep food from falling out of their mouths. Super handy. Crocodiles, for instance, are estimated to lose a significant portion of their food because they can't hold it in. Therapsids also developed chewing movements, moving their jaws side to side, which led to changes in their jaw structure. This had an unintended consequence. It made their hearing worse. Unlike reptiles, which use their jawbones to detect ground vibrations, therapsids' jaws evolved away from this function, leading to the development of an external ear to better catch airborne sounds. But getting and retaining energy wasn't enough. They needed to conserve it too. That's where fur comes in. Early therapsids developed fur and whiskers. We know this because fossilized bones show nutrient channels, especially around the face where whiskers are, indicating increased sensitivity. Fossilized poop, yup, you read that right, even contains ancient fur remnants, proving these critters were sporting some fuzz as far back as 300 million years ago. And speaking of adaptations, let's talk about the Carboniferous period, when dense forests dominated the planet. Insects like giant dragonflies and cockroach-like critters flourished thanks to higher oxygen levels. With no competition, early amphibians could thrive despite having less efficient circulatory systems. But when reptiles evolved, amphibians had to step up their game. And so, we lost the ability to fast. Normal cold-blooded animals can go for a year and a half without eating anything. I sometimes envy them, but we humans always seem to be hungry. On my trip from Moscow, I started snacking on the train. Then I had a couple of slices of pizza when I arrived, and I'll probably eat something else soon. It's an endless cycle of munching. Take reptiles like turtles and crocodiles. They can go for a year and a half without food, maybe even longer. I have red-eared slider turtles at home, and sometimes the kids forget to feed them for 2 weeks. They're fine. If they were hamsters, I wouldn't have any left by now. But those turtles just keep on living. During this time, new insect forms like stoneflies, caddisflies, and mayflies emerged. These insects had aquatic larvae that accumulated nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen in water before becoming adults and flying away. One mayfly might seem insignificant, but collectively, they made a huge impact. In some North American lakes, layers of shed mayfly skins can reach up to 1.5 meters thick. Over millions of years, these insects transported enormous amounts of nutrients from water to land. Meanwhile, plants with decent roots began stabilizing soils, further depleting water of nutrients. As the Permian period progressed, temperatures dropped, and then at the end of the period, it started warming up again. This combination of factors wreaked havoc on marine ecosystems, leading to one of the most devastating mass extinctions in Earth's history. Volcanic eruptions and other disasters only added to the chaos. The boundary between the Paleozoic and Mesozoic eras is marked by the end of the Permian period, which saw massive extinctions. Some of our ancestors survived, though, and through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, they evolved into mammals. Early mammals had their own set of problems. Initially, they laid small eggs. Imagine an echidna or a platypus egg, tiny and fragile, making survival tough. Marsupials developed next, but their embryos were often rejected by the mother's immune system before reaching full term, resulting in premature births and high mortality rates. Placental mammals solved this with the development of the placenta, a remarkable organ that evolved from a viral infection. The virus manipulated the immune system, allowing embryos to develop longer inside the mother. This organ, made from both maternal and embryonic tissues, created a protective barrier, enabling the embryo to grow larger and stronger before birth. The oldest known placental mammal, Juramaia, from China, dates back to the Jurassic period. Though dinosaurs dominated the landscape, these early mammals scurried around the forest floor, living nocturnally and feeding on insects. This nocturnal lifestyle led to a decline in their ability to see red and green colors. No use for these colors in the dark. Despite losing some visual capabilities, their sense of smell improved, helping them navigate their dimly lit world. Evolution is a trade-off, after all. But during the Mesozoic era, something amazing happened. Flowering plants emerged. They invented flowers, nectar, and fruits, changing the game entirely. Along came pollinators and wood recyclers like termites, ants, and bees. Oh, and butterflies too. The appearance of flowering plants set the stage for our modern ecosystems. Flowering plants are all about branching out, literally. Unlike the old-school trees with simple, straight branches, these new plants created a three-dimensional habitat teeming with life. This complexity required animals to develop acrobatic skills to navigate the tangled branches. Early mammals, especially, benefited from this environment. Their limbs evolved for grasping, and their shoulder and pelvic girdles became more flexible. Insects became a primary food source, and our ancestors loved them. Termites were a favorite snack, and even today, they're still on the menu for some species. Around the middle of the Cretaceous period, flowering plants thrived and diversified, solidifying their place in the ecosystem. By the end of the Cretaceous, small-leaved trees like birches and aspens were everywhere. While they might sound patriotic, they weren't great for grazing. These trees lacked nutrients, which contributed to the decline of some dinosaur species. During this time, our ancestors took to the trees, evolving into early primatomorphs like Purgatorius. This marked the beginning of the Cenozoic era and the rise of mammals. The early Cenozoic, particularly the Paleocene and Eocene epochs, was a golden age for our ancestors. With dinosaurs out of the picture, large predators were scarce. But by the end of the Paleocene, nocturnal predators like owls and tree-dwelling hunters began to appear, giving our ancestors a run for their money. Animals like Vulpavus and Viverravus started climbing trees, forcing early primates to become more agile and quick-witted. These early primates were generalists, eating everything from insects to fruits. Their teeth were adapted for a varied diet, with sharp points for biting insects and flat surfaces for chewing plants. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in our evolutionary journey. But we had our challenges. The good news was we were pretty fast. On tall trees, being quick meant we could raise our young ones for longer periods. Thus, the strategy of having fewer but larger babies with relatively big brains emerged. These youngsters lived longer and needed extended care, laying the foundation for learning and education. Unlike instincts and reflexes, these kids had to learn a lot. Adaptability became key. One day we were eating bugs, the next day worms, then nectar and fruits. Remembering where everything was also became crucial. But we did lose some fertility along the way. The ideal of big families and family values took a hit. Plus, our sense of smell diminished since it wasn't as vital up in the trees. Our whiskers, or vibrissae, also became less important. Unlike a cat, whose whiskers are quite handy, we started to lose ours. Even chimpanzees have whiskers, but they're not essential. When you're leaping from branch to branch, using touch isn't practical, vision becomes more important. Eyes started to face forward, gradually developing binocular vision. The Eocene was a warm period known as the Diocene optimum, with temperatures about 14 degrees warmer than today. It was so warm that even places like Canada and Greenland had tropical forests. Imagine climate scientists today freaking out over half a degree of global warming. They wouldn't have survived the Eocene. In these tropical forests, rodents and bats appeared, significantly impacting our ancestors' evolution. Our early relatives, being tree dwellers themselves, also wanted to take to the skies. After all, flying was a quick way to access resources like ripe dates. But bats beat us to it, filling that ecological niche. Rodents, with their specialized chewing apparatus, prevented our ancestors from dominating the ground initially. This was actually beneficial. Otherwise, we might have evolved into something akin to large rodents. Instead, primates stayed in the trees, evolving rapidly. Primates like Archicebus, an early tarsia-like creature, and Eosimias, the first true monkey, emerged. Their hands evolved from clawed fingers to nails, allowing them to grasp objects more efficiently. This paved the way for tool use and complex behaviors. But then, something nasty came along. Cats. Yes, those sneaky predators made life more complicated. Around the same time, vivarids, like civets, and weasels emerged too. Take the cats around here, cute, fluffy, and often demanding attention. But those ancient cats? Not so cuddly. They were apex predators, feasting on birds, rodents, and primates, including our ancestors. Essentially, these predators evolved specifically to hunt us down. In Africa and Asia, leopards and other big cats are still a threat to humans. Our ancestors had two options to evade these dangers: speed and size. Some evolved to become faster, leading to the development of monkey-like primates. For example, Cydenius was an intermediary between monkeys and apes. On the other hand, larger apes evolved to deter predators simply by their size. Bigger animals are less likely to be attacked. Being larger also meant they could consume more diverse food, including plants. Smaller apes relied more on insects, but as they grew bigger, catching bugs became energy inefficient. Instead, they turned to fruits, which required a larger digestive system to process. Eating colorful fruits also helped them redevelop color vision. Bright fruits and flowers stood out, making them easier to spot. However, as they grew larger, they lost their undercoat. Small animals needed this insulation, but larger ones did not. Modern primates either have a very rudimentary undercoat or none at all. The tail also became redundant. As they grew larger, using the tail for balance during fast jumps was less necessary. They left the tail behind as they evolved. Interestingly, some South American monkeys retained their grasping tails, using them to hold objects. Primates staying in the trees continued to evolve. Various large herbivores like elephants and rhinos appeared, shaping the landscape into savannas. Our ancestors, though still forest dwellers, grew to the size of modern chimpanzees, about 40 to 50 kilograms. These early hominins couldn't leap long distances anymore. While modern humans can barely manage a jump of 1.5 meters, ancient monkeys could leap up to 10 meters. Our jumping abilities certainly diminished. During the Miocene and Pliocene epochs, more geological changes were happening. India finally slammed into Asia after drifting towards it since the Mesozoic era. This collision pushed up the Himalayas, altering atmospheric circulation patterns and changing the climate. The climate started to cool significantly after a brief optimal period in the Miocene. Tropical forests in Africa began to disappear, and the situation was even worse in Eurasia, where many species went extinct. Our ancestors in Africa were forced to move into the emerging savannas. Initially, they didn't want to live in the savanna but preferred to dash from one grove to the next. In these open areas, predators like cats, which had migrated to Africa from Europe, were waiting for them. This pressure led our ancestors to stand on two legs. While they could have remained quadrupedal like baboons, they opted for bipedalism. Their bodies had already adapted to vertical climbing due to their larger size, making it easier to walk upright. Running on all fours with a big belly on narrow branches wasn't practical. Walking on two legs, while using their arms for balance, became more efficient. Recent discoveries of Denuvius fossils, with well-preserved pelvises and skeletons, illustrate this adaptation beautifully. These early humans walked on two legs in the trees and brought this habit down to the ground. The challenges of terrestrial life, including overheating, predators, and scattered food resources, led to a selection for increased sociality. Early humans developed smaller canines and shorter jaws, becoming gentler. Selfish individuals didn't survive long because they couldn't protect their offspring. Those who cared for each other and cooperated had better survival rates. The idyllic forest life was over. Competition with giant geladas, which were meter-high aggressive baboons, led to the extinction of many early hominins. Meanwhile, giant hoofed animals disappeared, replaced by the modern ones we know today. The same thing happened with giant predators like the saber-toothed cats and monstrous Pachycracuda. Their extinction created a brief window of opportunity, and our ancestors seized it. The early Homo species started to eat meat, requiring a larger brain and better tools. Their brains grew rapidly, crossing the so-called brain Rubicon at around 700 to 900 grams. Homo rudolfensis and Homo habilis emerged, using tools and spreading out. However, their tree-climbing days were over. Take Lucy, the famous Australopithecus afarensis. Her skeleton shows multiple fractures, suggesting she fell from a tree. This indicates that even 3.5 million years ago, our ancestors were struggling with their arboreal abilities. To thrive on the ground, they needed open spaces. At this time, voles appeared in Eurasia, burrowing and reshaping the land, creating grasslands. These new environments supported various hoofed animals, which later became vital food sources for early humans. Roughly 2 million years ago, humans began migrating out of Africa into these open spaces, reaching as far as Indonesia. Initially sticking to tropical zones, they eventually spread further. The tropical paradise was left behind, and those who stayed in Africa continued to evolve. Those who migrated faced new challenges, including ice ages in Europe, where they encountered mammoths and reindeer. The alternating glacial and interglacial periods created a constantly changing environment, pushing our ancestors to adapt continually. As they moved across diverse landscapes, their ability to innovate and survive was put to the test. However, there were some benefits during this time. Due to climate changes, giant deposits of loess, wind-blown silt, formed, creating extremely fertile soil. These loess deposits, sometimes up to 6 meters deep, became a foundation for future civilizations. Archaeologists love digging through these loess layers to uncover ancient artifacts, but loess also formed the basis of fertile farmland, supporting the rise of Eurasian civilizations. Thanks to these rich soils, we can sit here today, well-fed and housed, enjoying the fruits of our ancestors' labor. Around 350,000 to 400,000 years ago, our ancestors began hunting large game in Eurasia. They developed clothing and tools, and, as a side note, picked up lice along the way. Fire usage became common, leading to significant physical changes. Cooked food was easier to digest, reducing jaw and tooth size. Our pelvises became narrower, our stomachs smaller, and our rib cages more compact. We also learned to speak around this time, a huge leap forward. But the carefree life was gone for good, except for some modern folks who still enjoy a bit of relaxation. Then, around 73,000 to 74,000 years ago, disaster struck. The Toba supervolcano erupted, creating a massive crater that is now a lake. It was one of the largest eruptions in Earth's history, spewing vast amounts of ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to plummet. This sudden cooling led to glaciation, and many human species, such as the hobbits, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, faced extinction. Some survived in isolated pockets, even interbreeding with early modern humans, leaving traces in our DNA. The hobbits, however, were less fortunate. Archaeological evidence shows that some of our ancestors navigated through this ash, with tools found buried in Toba's ash layers in India. Imagine living under 6 meters of ash. Talk about a tough situation. There's a hypothesis that this global catastrophe cleared the path for our ancestors. Before the eruption, Homo sapiens who ventured out of Africa ran into Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others, making expansion difficult. But after the Toba eruption, their numbers dwindled, giving Homo sapiens a chance to spread out, and spread out they did. Around 50,000 to 55,000 years ago, Homo sapiens left Africa for the last time in a species-wide sense and settled across the planet. This brings us closer to the modern era, where we became the main factor in our own evolution. We try to make things better, but it doesn't always work out that way. Which side of our actions will tip the scale is a big question. We produce a lot but also generate waste, polluting our environment. Evolution has always been about adapting to challenges, whether it was developing lungs, legs, or fur. Now, we need to adapt to the mess we've created, which isn't easy. The main challenge is that the pace of environmental change, driven by us, is faster than we can adapt. With generation times of 25 years, we're outpaced by our own pollution. One potential solution is genetic engineering. For instance, some fungi can break down plastic. If we could incorporate the genes for these plastic-digesting enzymes into ourselves, imagine drinking from a plastic bottle and then digesting it on the spot, solving both pollution and hunger. Who knows what the future holds, but we have a unique advantage: our complex, active brains. Unlike our predecessors who simply perished or survived, we have the potential to change the game and ensure survival through innovation. It's anyone's guess where this will lead, but let's hope our so-called wise species, Homo sapiens, can navigate through this challenging landscape. After all, we have the brains. Now we just need to use them wisely. Thanks for joining us on this epic journey through our evolutionary history. From the primordial soup to modern Homo sapiens, our ancestors faced countless challenges and adapted in incredible ways. As we move forward, our intelligence and creativity will be key to overcoming new obstacles. If you enjoyed this dive into the past and want more fascinating insights, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. Let's keep exploring the amazing story of humanity together. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. Welcome back to the Curiosity Dude. Today, we're embarking on an incredible journey through time to explore how ancient humans migrated and filled every corner of the planet. From the first steps out of Africa to the farthest reaches of the globe, discover the fascinating stories of our ancestors' epic travels. How did they do it? What challenges did they face? Buckle up and get ready for an adventure through history that shaped the world as we know it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more mind-blowing insights into our past. Migration of ancient humans. How did we fill the entire planet, and how did it all happen? It's clear that not only did humans spread out, but so did our distant ancestors. This process has been going on forever, starting from way back in the Paleozoic era. But let's focus on our own history. Before we dive into human migrations, let's catch up on some news. Surprisingly, new findings keep emerging about events that happened thousands of years ago. In 2020, there were new discoveries about Neanderthal migrations. It turns out, Siberia was populated by Neanderthals at least twice. We don't have many Neanderthal sites in Siberia, but new studies and findings are painting a clearer picture. It appears that Neanderthals living in Denisova Cave and those in Okladnikov Cave weren't the same groups. Even though these caves are pretty close to each other, biologically and culturally, these Neanderthal groups were different. And the differences were pretty significant. They differed in DNA, morphology, what little we have, and culture. It seems the Neanderthals in Denisova Cave arrived first, where the Denisovans were already living. These Neanderthals mixed with the Denisovans and later with Homo sapiens too. They had their own culture and workshop. Then, about 50,000 years later, the Okladnikov Neanderthals with their own Mycoquien culture showed up. They had different mitochondrial DNA and set up camp in Okladnikov Cave. It's clear they didn't just stay put, they were hunters and gatherers, moving around. The Okladnikov Neanderthals also mixed with Homo sapiens. Interestingly, in the same layers of Okladnikov Cave, you can find bones of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. This shows that migration wasn't just a straightforward journey. It was a complex web of movements. It's easy for us to see these patterns today, but it wasn't always obvious that ancient migrations were so dynamic. As hunters, our ancestors had to keep moving to survive. They couldn't just stay in one place, or they would have run out of food. And if we look further back, the same thing happened not just with humans, but with primates too. Let's rewind to the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, the transition from the world of dinosaurs to the age of mammals. There, we meet some mysterious creatures called adapiforms. Adapiforms were intriguing little critters, potentially our distant cousins rather than direct ancestors. Their migration story is quite curious. The oldest adapiforms were found in India. At that time, India was an island floating in the Tethys Sea, isolated from Asia, Africa, and Europe. Fast forward a bit to the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and adapiforms pop up in North Africa and Europe. This is puzzling because, back then, North Africa was separate from Asia, Europe was separate from Asia, and India was still an island. How did these small primates cross vast oceanic distances? Not just them. Indian fauna included land turtles and non-aquatic snakes, which also managed to migrate between continents. Most likely, they traveled on floating vegetation rafts. Tropical rainforests with large trees could end up in the water after falling from riverbanks. For small creatures ranging from cockroach size to small monkeys, like the adapiforms, these trees were entire worlds. They could live on these floating rafts for days, maybe weeks, being carried across the ocean by currents. Sure, the chances of survival on these makeshift rafts were slim. But when you multiply millions of trees falling into rivers over millions of years, the odds aren't quite zero, especially for small creatures. These kinds of migrations happened repeatedly. Fast forward to the 16th century, Portuguese explorers followed the same ocean currents, knowing there was land across the ocean because driftwood from America occasionally washed up on African shores. Where there's driftwood, there's land. So they set sail and found it. Meanwhile, northern Spaniards had their own routes. And while they sailed on ships, our distant primate ancestors used logs. Multiply millions of logs over millions of years, and sure enough, they made it across. In fact, recent discoveries show that a group of parapithecids, previously known only from North Africa, existed in South America. Parapithecids were primitive monkeys, and finding them in Peru, on the other side of the Atlantic, is mind-blowing. These primates had to cross the entire African continent before making the ocean journey. In the tropics, traversing forests wasn't that difficult. They spread across Eurasia too, from France and Spain all the way to China. It's fascinating that our direct human ancestors were some of the biggest homebodies. While monkey-like primates spread from the Iberian Peninsula to East China and India, our ancestors stayed put in Africa for a long time. They only ventured out to places like the Middle East and parts of Eurasia much later. Human-like apes, even the smaller ones, weren't keen on moving far from their trees. As long as the climate was favorable and forests were plentiful, they stayed where they were comfortable. Though human-like apes originated in Africa, some, like orangutans and gibbons, eventually made it to places like Indonesia. But our very own human ancestors were the slowest to move out of Africa. While horses, pigs, jackals, hyenas, antelopes, elephants, and ostriches moved between continents, our ancestors were content in Central and East Africa, reluctant to leave until much later. This modern hypermobility of humans is a very recent development. When our ancestors evolved into bipedal beings, like Australopithecus, they were still mainly in East and South Africa. They ventured a bit into the Sahel zone, south of the Sahara, which was not a desert then but more like steppe. However, they didn't move much beyond these regions. Australopithecus moved through semi-open environments, not quite forests, but not complete grasslands either. This created distinct differences between East and South African populations, which we can identify as separate species. This gradual transition from one region to another is somewhat similar to what we see in modern baboons. Africa is vast, with different baboon species living in various regions. Just like our Australopithecus ancestors, these baboons don't tend to migrate far. However, slowly but surely, they move around a bit. Northern baboons differ significantly from their southern counterparts, and western baboons from eastern ones, with smooth transitional zones between them. It was likely the same with Australopithecus. Although we don't have many fossils from the regions in between, what we do have suggests a gradual spread. Later on, as Australopithecus evolved into the Homo genus around 2.5 to 2 million years ago, these migrations were still modest but present. Even the robust Australopithecines, or Paranthropus, were moving around. Sometimes we find fossils in surprising places, indicating that migrations did happen. It's not like they planned to settle new lands. They moved chaotically, like a Brownian motion. If they found a similar area nearby with resources and no competition, they would naturally spread out over time. Kilometer by kilometer, over millions of years, they eventually reached new continents. The key turning point in our sedentary evolution was around 2 million years ago when our ancestors finally started moving further and becoming more mobile. This migration was a long process. Our early ancestors, like Australopithecus, were bipedal but had short legs and stocky builds. Finally, the first Homo species developed longer legs and more modern body proportions. A great example is the skeleton known as KNMWT 15,000, or the Turkana boy. This Homo ergaster skeleton is about 1.5 million years old. Turkana boy, an adolescent, had long legs, a shortened rib cage, and relatively narrow shoulders. In modern times, his physique wouldn't stand out much among teenagers, but his face was a bit different. These long-legged humans were adapted for long-distance travel. They also had to modify their heat regulation systems to avoid overheating in open spaces. They overcame these challenges and learned to spread out far and wide. Interestingly, around 2 million years ago, we start finding humans outside of Africa. As I mentioned, while animals like ostriches, antelopes, donkeys, and others had moved in and out of Africa multiple times, our ancestors were some of the last to venture out. People often ask skeptically, why did they leave Africa if it was so good there? Why head north where it's cold and scary? Well, they didn't have maps or navigators. They didn't know about Africa or Eurasia. They just moved. If there was a similar savanna nearby with resources, they'd head there. Plus, the climate was about 4 degrees warmer than today. Places like southern Europe and parts of Asia were tropical paradises with elephants, rhinos, hippos, and ostriches. Walking slowly little by little, they moved north. Over 500,000 years, they gradually spread to new areas. Each step was small. Before this, there was a long prep period with our short-legged, sturdy Australopithecus ancestors. Eventually, early Homo species evolved longer legs and more modern proportions. One great example is the KNMWT 15,000 skeleton, also known as the Turkana boy or Neriakatome boy. This Homo ergaster skeleton is about 1.5 million years old and shows a young adolescent with long legs, a shorter ribcage, and relatively narrow shoulders. Physically not so different from modern teens, except for a slightly scary face. With their long legs and better heat regulation, these early humans could travel long distances. That's why, around 2 million years ago, we find evidence of humans outside Africa. Despite other animals repeatedly migrating in and out of Africa, our ancestors were among the last to leave. A common question is, why did they leave Africa if it was so great? Why move north to colder places? Well, early humans didn't have maps or GPS. They simply moved through savannas, following resources. Around 2 million years ago, global temperatures were about 4 degrees warmer than today, making many regions more hospitable. As they moved slowly bit by bit, they ended up in places like Georgia's Dmanisi site, where we find 5 amazing skulls and a rich array of fauna. These early migrations were gradual and opportunistic, not planned expeditions. Recent discoveries in Saudi Arabia and even the island of Socotra show that these early humans ventured far. Socotra, located between Arabia and East Africa, wasn't connected to the mainland, meaning early Homo species had to cross the ocean somehow. Despite common stereotypes, these ancient humans weren't primitive, club-wielding cavemen. They were intelligent, adapting to new environments and solving problems. They could lash together logs to create rafts and navigate to new lands. Later, we find Acheulean tools on islands like Crete, Cyprus, and various Greek islands, showing that ancient humans repeatedly crossed water. They reached places like Flores over 1 million years ago, which means even early Homo erectus managed sea crossings of 30 kilometers. Though they didn't reach Australia until much later, these journeys demonstrate their ingenuity and resilience. These weren't just random wanderers. They were problem solvers, innovators, and survivors. Of course, they never made it to America, so there were clear limitations. It's important not to overestimate their migration abilities. Their movements were slow and gradual, initially confined to tropical zones. They left Africa, spreading within the continent before venturing out. Some went left to Europe, others right to Asia. Migration was fairly rapid within these coastal regions, but they didn't venture too far inland. Deserts, mountains, jungles, those were no-go zones. Coastal living was familiar. Starting from the coast of, say, Eritrea, they might have crossed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, more likely than the Suez Isthmus, especially during periods of lower sea levels. The strait was only about 2 kilometers wide, and even now, the opposite shore is visible. If baboons, ostriches, and zebras could cross, so could humans. For them, it didn't matter much whether it was the coast of Eritrea or Yemen. The fauna and flora were similar, and they continued their beachcombing lifestyle. Moving north along the Red Sea or Persian Gulf, conditions changed, but moving east along the Indian Ocean coast, through Pakistan, India, and beyond to Indonesia, offered consistent environments. With the ocean on one side and familiar land on the other, they moved forward. The shoreline offered food, while the inland areas were less inviting. Geologically speaking, they spread rapidly once they left Africa. Within no time, they were along the entire coast, reaching Java and the easternmost parts of China. Our precise dating methods can't track every step they took, especially since many coastal sites are now underwater due to glacial melt and rising sea levels. Fishers in China once pulled up a lower jawbone of a Homo erectus, along with some fossil hyenas and other ancient debris. What a catch! Back then, though, that area was dry land. People didn't just migrate east and west along latitudes but north and south along meridians too. Early traces of migration are found in Georgia, but they went further. There were geographical challenges, like when the Black and Caspian Seas connected, creating a water barrier. People occasionally crossed it, as evidenced by a camel bone with deliberate tool marks found in the Levantovka quarry near Rostov-on-Don, dating back around 2 million years. Migrating north was less appealing initially due to harsher climates, but they slowly moved on, eventually encountering new environments. Around 1 to 1.5 million years ago, our ancestors started spreading more widely, evolving into different groups across regions. Thus began the era of diverse human species: Proto-sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and mysterious hobbits on islands like Flores, Luzon, and Sulawesi. Despite their differences, migration continued due to low population densities. By around 500,000 to 400,000 years ago, humans had reached temperate zones. As glaciers advanced during ice ages, humans had to adapt, inventing fire, clothing, and shelters to survive. Interbreeding among different human groups occurred, like Neanderthals with Denisovans and Proto-sapiens. Sapiens later mixed with Denisovans too. Archaeological and genetic evidence often reveal these ancient interactions, sometimes in surprising ways. One of my favorite examples is the femur from Dolní Věstonice 35, found in Czechia. Even today, Czechia is in Central Europe, but back then, it was more like the edge of Europe, with glaciers just to the north. Dolní Věstonice is rich with cultural artifacts, and the number 35 indicates there are at least 34 more fascinating finds. This particular femur belonged to a tall, strong man, and isotope analysis revealed he spent most of his life eating seafood. So, he grew up near the Mediterranean Sea but ended up in Czechia, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coast, during the peak of the Ice Age around 26,000 years ago. As an adult, he likely walked this vast distance, not in a straight line due to the Alps, but through zigzags, meeting different tribes with their own languages and cultures. He eventually settled in Dolní Věstonice, where he ended his journey. To me, he's the greatest traveler of all time. It's one thing for populations to migrate over generations, but this individual covered hundreds of kilometers alone. He survived unfamiliar terrain and various encounters, showcasing the resilience and adaptability of early humans. Absolutely. Individual cases like this illustrate broader migration patterns. By tracking the movement of objects like amber, cowrie shells, unique flint or obsidian types, we get a picture of these migrations. Take the young person from the Arini cave in northern Italy. His burial site was adorned with various artifacts, including beads made from shells. While living by the sea explains the shell beads, he also had a cowrie shell likely from the far south, a mammoth ivory pendant likely from the north, and reindeer antler scepters made in France. These indicate wide-ranging trade or exchange networks. He also had a black flint blade from France, showing far-reaching connections. Such finds, like seashells found deep in France, whale bone items far from any ocean, or Baltic amber in distant locations like Voronezh, show how far people and their goods traveled. These movements weren't just for survival, they were about culture and connection. Artifacts like Venus figurines, ornaments, and tools show similar styles across Germany, Austria, Czechia, and beyond to the Irkutsk region of Siberia, suggesting widespread cultural exchange among Homo sapiens. They spread east and north, even reaching the Arctic regions like the Yana site. And so, their paths diverged. The luckiest ones followed the southern routes, retracing the steps of earlier Homo erectus migrations. They ended up in places like Flores and Timor, eventually reaching Sahul, a landmass combining New Guinea, Australia, and Tasmania. As sea levels rose, Sahul split into separate islands, leaving people scattered across them. By around 36,000 years ago, if not earlier, humans reached places like the Solomon Islands, Bougainville, and Buka. These ancient people were catching oceanic fish, indicating they had well-built boats. The nearest islands were at least 300 kilometers away, showing their impressive seafaring skills. Migration across Melanesia is traced through obsidian, volcanic glass unique to specific volcanoes. Geologists have become adept at pinpointing the source of obsidian, revealing that it was transported thousands of kilometers across islands. While the southern route saw such maritime journeys, the northern path was taken by those not afraid of the cold. Neanderthals had ventured north, but they didn't go far beyond the Altai Mountains. However, by around 20,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, Homo sapiens pushed further north and east. They reached Beringia, the land bridge connecting modern-day Chukotka with Alaska. Although Beringia was mostly glaciated, people likely traveled along the coastlines, aided by their boats. For thousands of years, they navigated by keeping land to their left and water to their right, a strategy that had served them from Africa to the Americas. Despite glaciation, they continued to move, driven by the promise of new lands. Waves always brought signs of land from the east, so they ventured onwards, guided by their survival instincts and navigational skills. Even during the Soviet era with its Iron Curtain, anthropologists studying Eskimos and Chukchi found Coca-Cola bottles in remote villages. When asked, the locals pointed east and said they got them from relatives. Iron Curtain or not, they'd hop on sleds in winter or kayaks in summer and travel. Who could stop them? Certainly not the border guards stationed far away. And ancient humans in the Stone Age had even fewer restrictions. By around 30,000 years ago, more reliably between 25,000 and 24,000 years ago, and definitely by 14,000 years ago, humans had reached America. Evidence suggests there may have been 3 separate migrations, around 30,000 years ago, another 24,000 years ago, and a third around 14,000 years ago. The first waves might not have left many descendants, but the last one was successful. By then, the Ice Age was ending, Siberia was densely populated, and there was a well-established route for migrating groups. When they reached America, it was like paradise. No competition, abundant wildlife, and untapped resources. This led to rapid expansion southward, reaching the southern tip of South America. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, dating back to 14,000 years ago, possibly up to 18,000 years, show that humans quickly spread through the continent. Migration continued with 2 main routes, one along the Pacific coast and another through the interior. By 10,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had settled the entire planet. Denisovans, Neanderthals, and hobbits were gone, with only small, isolated groups remaining. People kept migrating, reaching places like Madagascar, Tahiti, Haiti, and Hawaii. By the 15th century, the planet was fully settled. Now, we've run out of new lands to explore, but our history of migration tells a remarkable story of human resilience and adaptability. Indeed, at least 30,000 years separate us from the time of the Neanderthals, and even more in some regions. Modern populations, like those near Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, are far removed from their ancient predecessors. Everyone outside Africa has a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, but it's not specifically tied to any current location. Over the last few thousand years, the population in places like southern Siberia has changed several times. First, Proto-Europeans moved from west to east. Then, Mongoloids moved from east to west, culminating in events like the Tatar-Mongol invasion. Later, Russian settlers moved in, followed by Cossacks and peasants. This constant movement means that current populations have little direct connection to those ancient ancestors. In modern times, people continue to move around. So, we're all connected in a very broad and indirect way, shaped by thousands of years of migration and mixing. It's fascinating to think how dynamic and interconnected human history really is. As people migrated and settled in new territories, they became distinct for various reasons: adaptation, genetics, and specialization. This led to different physical characteristics like skin color and hair types. This phenomenon happened with Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and even modern humans. Less mobile populations developed distinct traits faster. In Africa today, where people have mostly stayed put, we see a variety of races. While people outside Africa might find it hard to distinguish between different African groups, Africans themselves can clearly tell the difference, much like Europeans distinguish between Southern and Northern Europeans. Anthropologists study these differences, but Africa's complex political and logistical landscape makes this challenging. Nevertheless, migration, interbreeding, and adaptation have played significant roles in forming races. Even without moving, populations can develop unique characteristics over time. In recent history, migrations in Africa continued. The Bantu expansion from West Africa to southern regions shaped many cultures. Similarly, migrations from Ethiopia to the south brought the Maasai, who are still expanding in Kenya and Tanzania today. So, it's not just ancient mixtures that created races. Modern movements have also played a crucial role. And that's a whole different story. As humans spread out across the globe, it had an interesting impact on our genetics. Take the DRD4 gene, for example. While everyone has this gene, the number of copies varies among people. This gene regulates dopamine receptors. Dopamine, a chemical linked to pleasure and reward, has receptors that, when working well, make us feel good. If these receptors aren't as effective, people might seek more dopamine through new experiences. Interestingly, different groups have different numbers of DRD4 copies. For instance, Bushmen in southern Africa have a version that makes them restless. They can't sit still, they need to move and explore. If they don't, they risk starvation in the harsh desert. On a genetic level, this wanderlust is ingrained. In contrast, Chinese or Japanese people, who come from agricultural societies, often have a different version. These societies valued stability, with people tending their fields and focusing on slow, meticulous work. Their dopamine receptors work great, so they feel content without needing to explore. They find satisfaction in their daily routines, like tending to a rice paddy or crafting something from jade. These genetic differences illustrate how our migrations and lifestyles shaped us in unique ways. Evolution tailored our instincts to the environments we lived in, whether it was the endless movement of hunter-gatherers or the settled life of farmers. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. If you know more about migrations than I do or have migrated more, feel free to leave a couple of dislikes. They help the channel grow too. Share your thoughts and stories about migration, where you think it will lead us, and let's keep the conversation going. Don't be afraid to migrate, but let's not go overboard. And if you're really adventurous, aim for the stars. Support the channel, share your impressions with friends and family, and let's create a bright future together. Catch you in the next video.
Alright, so here we go. Welcome back to Curiosity Dude's channel. Today we're diving into how we became smart little critters and how our brains evolved. But wait, it's not just about brain evolution. It's also about how this evolution is linked to our diet. So, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We got plenty of interesting podcasts coming your way. Evolution has a way of simplifying things. What's important evolves faster, and once it reaches an ideal state, it doesn't change much. Our diet and brain evolution showcase this perfectly. Back when we were tiny creatures scampering around in the late Mesozoic and early Cenozoic eras, we were mainly insectivorous. To be precise, we were pretty much omnivorous. Purgatorius, the first primatomorphs, were the most omnivorous mammals of their time. Most mammals back then, with few exceptions, were almost exclusively insectivorous, which makes sense. If you're a small creature living even in a tropical climate, you'll be insectivorous because when it gets a bit cooler at night, what else can you do? If you're small, you lose heat quickly, especially if you're cold-blooded, so you need to replenish your energy losses by eating at night. To get as many calories as possible in a short amount of time from small bites, because hey, you're tiny, so big meals are out of the question. You'd have to munch on insects. What other source of calories could you find? So, munch away on bugs. It's a smorgasbord out there, especially with the emergence of social insects like termites, ants, and bees during the Jurassic-Cretaceous transition. Our Purgatorius ancestors, those early primatomorphs, were savvy little guys. They chomped on insects and fruits. This dual diet was a game changer. Sure, there were other plant-eating mammals like condylarths leaning toward herbivory, but most ended up as hoofed animals. Our tree-dwelling ancestors, though, could munch on fruits as well, which were already flourishing by the end of the Mesozoic. Leaves, while not the most nutritious option, were also on the menu in the tropics, where you could find a fatty leaf, resin, nectar, or even bird eggs. Basically, if it existed and was edible, they ate it. But insects were the most crucial part of the diet, and to catch those bugs, you had to stay agile. And there you have it, a reason for brain evolution. When you're hopping from branch to branch, you need to measure your jumps accurately to avoid a disastrous fall. Our ancestors were pretty good at this leaping business. And hunting insects? Well, insects come in all shapes and sizes. Imagine a grasshopper. Let's say a 5 centimeters grasshopper facing off against our 6 to 10 centimeters ancestor Purgatorius. That grasshopper must have seemed like a formidable beast. Even today, a regular old grasshopper can give you a nasty bite if it gets the chance. So, hunting insects was a small but vital incentive to get smarter. And then, of course, our ancestors didn't just eat insects. They ate fruits, leaves, and whatever else they could find. That was the first spark, the initial stage of brain evolution. As time went on, throughout the Paleocene and at least the first half of the Eocene, our ancestors grew in size and became increasingly active climbers. With this growth came several changes. As they grew and became more agile, their grip strengthened and they developed opposable thumbs on their hands and feet, perfect for grasping branches. These changes in their physical form led to changes in their brains as well. When they were small and lived in dense foliage and forest floors, their primary sense was smell. Next up were those whiskers. Our ancestors had well-developed whiskers, evident from the small holes in their skulls where blood vessels fed these sensory hairs. But as they grew bigger and more agile, smell and touch, via whiskers, became less important. When hopping from branch to branch, whiskers didn't really touch much, and scents were all around but less directional. Thus, vision took the lead, smell declined, and the brain's front part shrank while the back part expanded, improving their jumping skills. The cerebellum grew, evident from brain molds of late plesiadapiforms and early adapiforms. Their brain shape changed, from an elongated brain to a triangular one with a narrow front and wide back. Chewing muscles, initially attached along the brain case, moved to the front. With growing plant food intake, their jaws evolved for vertical strong bites. Insect-eating ancestors had pincer-like jaws to catch and crush insects with sharp teeth. Now, with more fruits and nuts, jaw strength increased. Jaws, once like pincers, became like nutcrackers, shorter faces, stronger vertical muscles, and a more compact structure. Monkeys and apes, unlike lemurs with dog-like snouts, evolved shorter faces, reflecting these changes. Our jaws got shorter and higher, altering our forehead configuration. The forehead shortened and narrowed as the olfactory parts of the brain shrank, while chewing muscles moved to the front. This caused the so-called post-orbital constriction, less visible in modern humans but prominent back then. The back of the brain case freed up from chewing muscle pressure, allowing it to grow more, and skull sutures stayed open longer. This late fusion of skull sutures is a unique human trait. Human skulls consist of separate bones with sutures that can grow until they fuse in our 20s and fully fuse by 55 or even 80 years old. But earlier ancestors had sutures that closed much later, allowing the brain case to grow. In strepsirrhines, the metopic suture between the frontal bones remains unfused longer due to their reliance on smell. But as our ancestors' sense of smell declined, the metopic suture fused sooner, reflecting another quirky turn in our evolutionary tale. Strange but fascinating, isn't it? All right, let's wrap it up with a fun spin. So, as the back of our skulls grew, the parts we now flaunt as humans, like our sense of smell, actually shrank. This shrinkage made room for the rear of our brains to expand, leading to a sort of evolutionary leap forward. About 50 to 40 million years ago, our ancestors experienced significant changes. Those strong chewing muscles moved to the front, the back of the skull grew, visual and motor parts like the cerebellum got bigger, and the tactile sensitivity of our hands increased. The brain's parietal lobe started linking different senses, leading to a more integrated perception. Fast forward, and we got bigger, crossing the 500-gram threshold, a crucial divide between small, night-dwelling insectivores and larger, day-active creatures. Larger size meant less reliance on insects for food. Fruits and leaves became mainstays. This switch to a fruit-rich diet lasted from about 45 to 40 million years ago until more recent times. Around 28 to 27 million years ago, actual apes emerged, growing larger. Interestingly, our brains evolved sluggishly along the way. Crazy, right? Evolution's got more plot twists than a soap opera. So, here's the kicker. Different systems in our bodies evolved at different speeds. Teeth and jaws evolved first because eating is sacred. That's priority number one. Then came hands and feet because movement matters, either to get to food or to flee from danger. Early plesiadapiforms had brains like modern insectivores, which makes sense. Early narrow-nosed monkeys like Egyptopithecus had cat-sized brains that structurally resembled lemur brains, despite looking more like monkeys. Their olfactory bulbs were still quite developed compared to us, though. When it comes to early hominoids, we see their brains were primitive, similar to early narrow-nosed monkeys. They had human-like teeth and somewhat human-like hands and feet, but their brains were still simple, narrow, small frontal lobes about 130 grams. Even with such modest brains, they thrived. Evolution. It's full of wild rides, isn't it? And then enters the wild card. Sociality. Early primates weren't the sharpest tools in the shed, so their social structures were pretty basic. But for more advanced monkeys and apes, social interaction drove brain evolution. Our brains evolved for communication, essential for cooperation, avoiding danger, and gathering food. This brain evolution continued until the early Australopithecines. Their brains, around 130 grams, grew to 300 to 400 grams, still small compared to modern human brains. Australopithecines, with brains akin to modern chimps, had similar tasks. Their occipital lobes grew as they ventured into the savanna. Their frontal lobes developed a bit more since their hands were free for various tasks, even if they hadn't mastered tools yet. They likely used sticks and stones and foraged roots and berries. So, while their brains didn't change drastically, their social structures and tool use started setting the stage for further evolution. Evolution's got more plot twists than a soap opera, right? The real breakthrough happened between 2.5 and 2 million years ago, or even up to 1.5 million years ago. It wasn't an overnight switch, but a gradual process marking the transition from Australopithecus to early Homo. Interestingly, the usual evolutionary sequence of teeth first, then limbs, then brains flipped here. Brains took the lead while teeth and limbs stayed relatively unchanged. Around 2.5 million years ago, our ancestors started to lean towards a meat-eating diet. This wasn't immediate, but happened over a long period. Thankfully, we didn't become full-blown predators, but our diet shifted significantly in that direction. Evolution loves to keep things interesting. So, what really went down during this time? There was this big shift to savannas, which transformed thorny bushes into open grasslands. Suddenly, powerful competitors emerged, like mega-herbivore pigs, similar to modern warthogs but bigger, and baboons, our primate cousins who evolved in the same African savannas under the same conditions. Baboons had a head start because they didn't have to transition from four-legged to two-legged movement, saving evolutionary time. While we spent 3 million years getting upright, baboons reached their peak 3 to 2.5 million years ago. Fossil Therapithecus baboons were giants, weighing around 100 kilograms and standing tall. Modern baboons are impressive, but these guys were even more so. They were strictly plant eaters, a rare trait for primates, but they made it work. Fascinating how these evolutionary dynamics play out, right? Ah, yes, those gnarly rivals with their powerful jaws and big old canines. Baboons, for instance, were formidable competitors. They were social, banding together for protection, and they were definitely not to be messed with. They outpaced our ancestors, the Australopithecines, leading to a massive die-off among them. Only a few species like the South African Setiba and Australopithecus garhi hung on. Around this time, the climate shift towards more open savannas led to the extinction of many large herbivores that once thrived in dense thickets. Giant buffalo, hippos, rhinos, elephants, short-necked giraffes, and other megafauna either perished or adapted in ingenious ways. Giraffes, for example, evolved their long necks to reach tree canopies, and some buffalo moved into the shadows. As the herbivores dwindled, so did the predators. The whole ecosystem was reshaping itself, and our ancestors had to adapt quickly or face extinction themselves. Evolution sure doesn't play favorites, huh? Exactly. As the megafauna and large predators dwindled, the predator lineup in Africa got pretty sparse. We're left with a handful of big predators: lions, leopards, and not-so-large cheetahs. Hyenas, though sizable, aren't the top dogs. African wild dogs are fierce, but not large. And then you've got jackals and wolves, which aren't all that intimidating. Bears vanished from Africa at this time, too. With fewer predators, lions specialized in hunting zebras, antelopes, and wildebeest. Leopards stalked gazelles, and cheetahs chased down their prey with mad speed. Hyenas and the like scavenged what they could. Around 2.5 million years ago, this created an open niche for medium-sized predators. Cue our ancestors. These early hominins transitioning from Australopithecines to early Homo jumped into this new niche. Evolution's twists and turns sure keep things interesting, don't they? Right now, our ancestors were in a bit of a transitional phase. The shift to a meatier diet, thanks to our omnivorous, insect-eating past, led to significant changes. Meat, lacking plant cell walls, is easier to chew and provides more calories. So, less chewing meant more energy with less effort, pretty handy. This diet shift favored individuals with smaller jaws. Smaller jaws weren't necessarily better, but they were no longer a disadvantage. Chewing muscles were the first to change. Skulls show this through the reduced attachment points for these muscles. Australopithecines had large crests, while early Homo species had smaller, more human-like skulls. Jaws remained relatively large, but teeth began to shrink. With less energy spent on chewing, brain size started to increase rapidly. Evolution really threw a curveball here. Exactly. Catching meat was way tougher than munching on grass. Grass just grows there, but meat fights back, literally. You have to outsmart it. This challenge led to the development of early language signs, as hunting required coordination and communication. Our ancestors, not being natural predators, had to invent tools. Around 2.6 million years ago, the first tools with sharp edges appeared, clearly made for butchering meat. Making tools was tricky and needed brain power. Those who could make and use tools effectively gained an evolutionary advantage. As they relied more on meat, chewing muscles decreased, as seen from the skulls. Reduced jaws meant less chewing, but more thinking. Brains started to grow quickly, as smaller jaws were no longer a disadvantage. One thing led to another, and before you know it, brains were booming and jaws were shrinking. Evolution at its finest. And there it is, we crossed the so-called brain Rubicon. This refers to a brain size of about 800 to 900 grams, sometimes considered as low as 700 grams. It marks the crucial boundary where smaller brains can't support tool-making and complex thought, while larger brains can. Early Homo species between 2.5 to 1.5 million years ago hovered around this brain Rubicon. Homo rudolfensis had big jaws and teeth, but weaker muscles. Then came Homo habilis with smaller jaws and teeth and less muscular strength. Their brains just kept growing. At around 700 to 900 grams, brains could handle basic survival tasks like foraging. But we didn't stop there. We weren't specialized hunters, so our brains continued to grow and develop. Evolution is wild, isn't it? All right, so here's the scoop. We were omnivores, making tools and competing with each other. Different human species like Paranthropus and Australopithecus were around. Those with beneficial mutations, bigger brains, thrived because they could better care for their offspring, passing on these brainy genes. Less fortunate, less intelligent ones didn't make it. As a result, brains grew rapidly until about 25,000 years ago when they started to shrink. But that's a tale for another time. Brain evolution was closely tied to our diet, and vice versa. So, eat well, think about what you eat, and you'll be just fine. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, join the Telegram channel, leave comments, and share your thoughts. There are undoubtedly more factors at play, and your version might be just as interesting. Like, dislike, whatever you feel. Just engage. Cheers, and until next time. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a fascinating topic. How possible was the origin of man? Not in the form of man. Could centaurs, mermaids, gnomes, elves, trolls, or any other mythical creatures exist from a scientific perspective? We'll explore the latest scientific studies, ancient myths, and some mind-blowing possibilities that will make you question everything you know about evolution. So grab your popcorn, hit that subscribe button, and let's unravel the mysteries of human origins together. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments and share your own migration stories. Let's get curious. Stay curious, and let's dive in. How possible was the origin of humans? Not in the form of humans. Is it possible for centaurs, mermaids, dwarves, elves, trolls, or someone like that from a scientific point of view? Although this topic seems fantastical, there is some relatively recent scientific news about it. For example, in 2020, two unrelated studies showed that in Central America, on the islands, broad-nosed monkeys have a tendency to come down to the ground. There are these broad-nosed monkeys called capuchins. Everyone saw them in the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, where a capuchin monkey with a coin was running around. These capuchins live in trees because they are afraid of predators like ocelots and jaguars. But on islands near the coast of Panama, where there are no such predators, capuchins descend to the ground much more actively and feel freer both day and night because no one eats them. In the jungles on the mainland where predators exist, they behave extremely cautiously, avoiding the ground and hiding at night, only coming out at certain times when predator attacks are least likely. Another similar but ancient news comes from Cuba, where there were fossil monkeys called Paralata. These monkeys were found on various Caribbean islands. Judging by their skeletons, these monkeys had a more terrestrial lifestyle than modern broad-nosed monkeys like howler monkeys. These island primates grew larger, up to about 20 kilograms, which is significant for South American monkeys. They became more terrestrial because there were no terrestrial predators. However, later on, the ancestors of modern Indians arrived on Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and other Caribbean islands, and this led to the extinction of the monkeys. To this day, it's still a question whether these monkeys survived until the arrival of Europeans because they disappeared around that time. So, evolution sometimes moves towards more human-like traits. But remember, evolution is a process, a survival statistic. It's not a woman with a club or a man with a rake sorting through what survives and what doesn't. And it's simply the mathematics of survival. So there's no universal law that dictates someone must evolve into humans or become like us. This actually opens up more possibilities because the history of life on Earth is incredibly rich, with many different forms emerging over 4 billion years, many of which had a decent shot at becoming intelligent. One of the key elements of our intelligence is our versatile hands. Biologically speaking, humanity is defined by 3.5 traits. Small canines, half a trait, bipedalism, opposable thumb hands, and large brains. Our hands with opposable thumbs are crucial. While labor didn't create humans out of apes, it certainly finished the job, evolving Australopithecus into Homo. This co-evolved with our brains, but it could have happened differently. Based on mantises, crabs, or other creatures, we could imagine completely different paths. Arthropods, for example, have a wide variety of limbs and adaptations. My favorite, the acanthodes, could have multiple specialized limbs. One pair for cooking, another for writing, another for hearing. With more diverse functions, their brains might develop differently, solving new tasks we can't even imagine. Just like chimpanzees can't fathom flying to the moon, our own brain structures limit what we can conceive. But other species might evolve brain regions for tasks we can't dream of. In ancient history, back in the Paleozoic or even Cambrian periods, there were cephalopods, great candidates for developing intelligence. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds imagines tentacled Martians, reflecting this possibility. Why go all the way to Mars when we have our own highly developed cephalopods in our seas? Modern octopuses, for example, have complex ganglia that function almost like our brains. They're incredibly intelligent. They can get angry, joke, hate, play, and even engage in constructive activities. One of my favorite stories involves an octopus at an aquarium who was mistreated by a staff member. Whenever the staff member came near, the octopus would squirt water at them, remembering the mistreatment and retaliating. This behavior shows their impressive memory and emotions. Octopuses can also build simple structures, like stacking stones to create a shelter, and mimic other sea creatures like crabs, sea snakes, and fish by changing their color and texture. However, octopuses face several challenges. They lost their shells early on, and while some have internal shells, these aren't as supportive as a vertebrate skeleton. On land, an octopus would struggle to support itself. Though our ancestors managed to evolve from invertebrates to vertebrates with arms and legs, octopuses would need significant adaptation. Octopuses don't have parental teaching. Each octopus learns independently, but parents usually die before their offspring hatch, preventing knowledge transfer. Solving this would be crucial for any cephalopod evolution toward intelligence. Moreover, octopuses became perfectly adapted to their environment early on, leading to little evolutionary change since the Cambrian period. They're well suited to their marine habitat, which hasn't changed much. But who knows what the future holds? Other creatures like terrestrial arthropods, spiders, crabs, and insects also show promise. Insects like ants, termites, and bees exhibit remarkable collective intelligence, building complex structures and using sophisticated communication methods. However, insects face size limitations due to their exoskeletons. As they grow larger, their exoskeletons must thicken, becoming too heavy to support. This and the need to molt restrict their size and continuous growth. Besides, they have an open circulatory system. Their heart is just a simple tube that pumps hemolymph, a fluid equivalent to blood in insects, into the body cavity, where it bathes the organs directly. This system doesn't provide targeted delivery of oxygen and nutrients to specific tissues. For example, as I speak and think, my blood flows primarily to my brain, not so much to my left heel because it's not needed there right now. Insects, however, either activate everything or nothing at all because they have one body cavity where the heart just mixes everything. Insects also have a tracheal respiratory system, tubes that permeate their entire bodies, allowing gases to diffuse directly. These tubes even penetrate the brain, meaning air literally flows through their heads. However, as insects grow larger, diffusion becomes insufficient to transport oxygen to distant body parts. That's why fossil insects like Meganeura, a giant dragonfly, could reach about 30 centimeters in length, and modern stick insects can grow to similar lengths, but not beyond. They remain thin and long because they can increase their body volume significantly, limiting their brain size and intelligence. These challenges are theoretically solvable, as our ancestors faced similar issues. Insects have just found their niche and stayed there. If you didn't know, we live on a planet dominated by insects. There are more ants in a single field than humans on Earth. Insects have evolved in their own remarkable ways, with various forms and social structures like ants, termites, and bees. Their evolutionary limitations from their past have held them back, but there are other candidates for advanced evolution. For example, fish. At some point, fish ventured onto land, becoming tetrapods and eventually evolving into mammals and humans. Other fish, like lungfish, also moved onto land but adapted too well to their semi-aquatic lifestyle. Lungfish can bury themselves in mud, forming a mucus cocoon and surviving for up to 4 years until rain revives them. This excellent adaptation to drying conditions kept them from evolving further onto land. From the Paleozoic era, spanning hundreds of millions of years, creatures like lobe-finned fish and coelacanth, such as the Latimeria found near the Comoros and Sulawesi, showcased remarkable evolutionary traits. These lobe-finned fish, similar to our ancestors, lived near the shores and eventually ventured onto land. However, coelacanth became deep-sea dwellers, walking on the ocean floor with limb-like fins, remaining largely unchanged for about 400 million years. A fascinating example is the acanthodians, small fish with multiple pairs of fins. Our ancestors had pectoral fins, now our arms, and pelvic fins, now our legs, while acanthodians had up to 7 pairs of fins. These extra fins could have led to diverse evolutionary paths, potentially producing centaur-like creatures with multiple pairs of limbs. They could have evolved more quickly by skipping stages like climbing trees and developing bipedalism. With horizontal spines, these creatures could have expanded their brains faster, avoiding the balance issues and spinal problems humans face. In the Paleozoic era, they could have exploited new environments, preying on emerging insects and developing complex behaviors. By the end of the Paleozoic, hypothetical intelligent beings might have emerged long before humans. Imagine these creatures with horizontal bodies, free forelimbs, and a vast array of brain functions. They could have developed advanced skills, utilizing their multiple limbs for various tasks. While this is purely hypothetical, it demonstrates the limitless possibilities evolution can offer. The acanthodians faced a major challenge. They lived in the well-lit upper layers of the ocean, not near shores or rivers. They were perfectly adapted to their three-dimensional aquatic world, streamlined and fast, with no need to venture onto land. As a result, some evolved into bony fish while others went extinct. When our ancestors did emerge onto land, they explored various adaptations. Early tetrapods like Acanthostega, Ichthyostega, and Tiktaalik exhibited different numbers of digits. While our 5-digit configuration prevailed, there were 6- and 7-digit versions, like the Tularpetan with its 6 fingers and toes. Visiting the Paleontological Museum in Moscow, you can see these unique limb structures. Our ancestors ultimately retained the 5-digit form, although horses evolved to 1 digit and ostriches to 2, making them more specialized than us. Evolution could have favored other configurations, like multiple limbs resembling tentacles or lateral branches. As amphibians evolved into reptiles and eventually synapsids, various paths were explored. For example, therapsids like therocephalians and cynodonts were similar. Cynodonts, our direct ancestors, developed features like secondary palates, allowing for advanced olfaction and efficient eating. This adaptation separated the nasal and oral cavities, enhancing their sense of smell without hindering eating. Therapsids, covered in fur and potentially giving birth to live young, were precursors to mammals. Despite these fascinating divergences, cynodonts emerged victorious, leading to the mammals we know today. Therocephalians, on the other hand, had different skull structures and never developed a proper secondary palate, limiting their diet to small prey. This restricted their growth and prevented them from becoming large predators or herbivores. Their olfactory senses remained underdeveloped compared to cynodonts, our ancestors, whose forebrain evolution was heavily influenced by advanced olfaction. As cynodonts evolved, they developed a secondary palate, separating the nasal and oral cavities. This allowed for a powerful sense of smell and efficient feeding, crucial for survival. These adaptations led to the dominance of mammals, while therocephalians faded away by the Triassic period. Numerous mammalian lines emerged, each with unique adaptations. Multituberculates, for instance, developed highly specialized teeth but ultimately lost out to more versatile rodents and primates. Marsupials, too, explored various niches but faced limitations due to their reproductive system, where they gave birth to underdeveloped embryos. Among later primates, Gigantopithecus is one of my favorites. These massive apes had the potential for significant brain development and could have become a peaceful, large-brained species. Imagine gentle giants like Buddhist sages philosophizing in bamboo forests. However, they face competition from more adaptable Homo species migrating from Africa. Climate changes and evolving ecosystems further challenge Gigantopithecus, leading to their extinction. Similarly, lemurs in Madagascar, an isolated ecosystem, evolved unique adaptations but remained limited by the lack of significant predators compared to mainland Africa. On isolated islands or closed environments, even more primitive creatures like reptiles or dinosaurs could have evolved into intelligent beings. If dinosaurs had been isolated on a large island or a place like Australia and hadn't gone extinct, they might have developed intelligence. However, reptiles lack a neocortex in their brains. Even though they might develop one, their strong jaws and horizontal body pose challenges. Dinosaurs, and birds for that matter, have vertical legs but horizontal bodies. A large head would be cumbersome, making it difficult to balance. They must choose between large jaws for predation or large brains for intelligence. Both aren't feasible. The laying of eggs also limits them, as hatchlings are born at a fixed size and can't be nurtured for long periods. Although some reptiles and amphibians show rudimentary care for their young, it's not enough for advanced development. Birds could have evolved intelligence, given some species like New Caledonian crows and Kea parrots show remarkable cognitive abilities. However, flying necessitates lightness, and a large brain would be detrimental. Birds' brains are good in their own way, with well-developed subcortical nuclei, but their behavior is largely instinctual and pre-programmed. Their rapid development from hatchling to flight readiness leaves little time for extended learning. Double respiration in birds complicates live birth, limiting them to egg-laying and reducing the potential for extended parental care. With quick maturity, there's less opportunity for complex learning. Returning to primates, other species like Homo naledi and Neanderthals could have become modern-day gnomes. Living in caves or underground might lead to reduced resources, smaller brains, simplified structures, and cultural loss over time. Subterranean existence leads to sensory reduction and a lack of large predators, resulting in simplified lifestyles. While cave creatures like Proteus salamanders can live long, their inactive and sensory-deprived lives don't favor advanced intelligence. Theoretically, some primates or other creatures could return to the water and become some kind of ichthyanders, water-human hybrids. However, there are several limitations. The human brain is highly energy-intensive, requiring a significant amount of calories and oxygen. If we converted the oxygen requirements of a human brain, weighing about 1.5 kilograms, into fish gills, the gills would need to be the size of a stadium. Although more accurate calculations show they wouldn't be quite that large, the gills would still be impractically big. Take beavers, otters, seals, whales, and dolphins, for example. They have some amazing adaptations. Beavers build dams and slap their tails on water. Otters are lively and resilient. Seals are playful, and dolphins are intelligent. However, as these animals adapt to aquatic life, their limbs transform into flippers, and in dolphins, legs disappear entirely while their arms become fins. This limits their ability to perform complex tasks. Our intelligence is tied to our ability to manipulate objects with our hands, which dolphins and other marine mammals cannot do. Dolphins have demonstrated the use of tools, such as grabbing sponges or coral pieces to stir up sediment and create a murky ring to trap fish. While they show some signs of intelligence and even have what appears to be a form of language, their intellectual capacity remains limited. Their primary task is to outsmart fish, which does not require advanced cognitive abilities. Additionally, dolphins' dental systems have simplified with pointed teeth or, in the case of large whales, baleen. This limits their culinary diversity. Our varied diet has driven much of our progress. So, while ichthyanders could theoretically evolve, it would likely require genetic engineering rather than natural evolution. The challenges related to their skeletal structure, limbs, breathing, and heart function would need to be addressed. So, evolution has indeed created many alternative developmental paths, from invertebrates to the first fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and among mammals, various primates and other species. However, each path faced limitations. The unique combination of circumstances that led to humans was the only one that fully realized. This doesn't mean other possibilities can't exist, but their likelihood is very low. Just like there is only one species of aardvark, one species of giraffe, and one species of ii, there is only one species of Homo sapiens right now. The probability of another intelligent species emerging is very slim. There were other alternatives, like our ancestors becoming intelligent due to tree-dwelling habits. They could have specialized in gliding or flight, like Colugo with gliding flight or bats with true flight. However, these adaptations imposed significant constraints. Flying mammals, even warm-blooded and viviparous like bats, can't give birth to large-brained, heavy offspring due to flight limitations. Bats live long, around 20 years, and have social structures, like vampire bats sharing blood. But they can't develop large brains because they need to quickly learn to fly and harden their bones, making large heads impractical. Theoretically, bats could become intelligent if they reverted to a terrestrial lifestyle. Birds like penguins and ostriches adapted to land under specific conditions, but they don't need to develop intelligence. In environments like Antarctica, survival and competition with predators are more critical than intelligence. On islands, birds like the dodo or flightless cormorants thrived without the need for high intelligence. Ostriches in the African savanna, where our ancestors evolved, don't need to be intelligent. They are large and fast, capable of defending themselves with powerful kicks. Bats never returned to a terrestrial lifestyle, possibly due to their specialization and unique limb structures. While it's theoretically possible, it hasn't happened yet. Evolution provides endless fascinating possibilities and pathways, shaped by various constraints and circumstances. There are indeed other intelligent creatures like elephants. Elephants are known for their intelligence, memory, and social structures. They can perform tricks, paint pictures, and use their trunks as tools. Elephants have leaders, usually the oldest and largest female, and they can migrate long distances and dig for minerals to supplement their diet. They nurture their young for a long time, and their brains can weigh up to 9 kilograms, averaging around 4 kilograms, significantly more than the average human brain. However, despite their intelligence and tool-using abilities, elephants face few threats from predators. Large size and social grouping provide safety, reducing the need for further cognitive evolution. Historically, predators like saber-toothed cats posed a threat, but today, only rarely do lions target elephants, usually in desperate situations. Elephants have evolved significantly over 40 million years, adapting to various environments and growing larger brains. Yet their herbivorous diet simplifies their challenges. They mainly need to find food and water. Unless their size decreases, making them more vulnerable, or they face new challenges requiring enhanced intelligence, their evolutionary path toward greater cognitive complexity remains uncertain. Other creatures in similar ecological niches could have evolved intelligence, particularly among predators. Carnivores have complex social interactions and hunting strategies, which might drive further cognitive development. Humans evolved from tree-dwelling, omnivorous, social ancestors with grasping limbs. When considering predators, different groups have their limitations. For instance, felines, even social ones like lions, are highly specialized hunters with no need to develop further. They hunt prey like zebras or antelopes, and their evolutionary path doesn't require advanced social behaviors or intelligence. Omnivorous but non-social animals like bears are ecological analogs to humans. Bears eat a diverse diet and live in similar environments but lack social structures. Their interactions are minimal, usually limited to gathering at salmon runs. While bears are intelligent compared to other forest creatures, their solitary nature limits further cognitive development. Another intelligent creature, although not a predator, is the pig. Pigs are also omnivorous and share some anatomical similarities with humans. They even hunt small deer and have versatile diets. However, pigs have specialized limbs, hooves, that restrict their ability to manipulate objects, thus limiting the development of advanced intelligence. Another intriguing possibility lies with canids, particularly wolves. While dogs are intelligent, wolves are even smarter. Wolves are ecological analogs to humans. They eat a varied diet, can live almost anywhere, and are highly social. They raise their young, teach them skills, and have been observed using tools to a certain extent. One fascinating story involves a group of wolves in the Caucasus that drove elk onto a sharp stake, using it as a hunting aid for generations. When the stake rotted away, the wolves were left confused, and the group eventually died out. Despite their intelligence, wolves face limitations. They are strictly terrestrial and haven't evolved the versatile hands needed for tool use. Their paws, while agile, aren't designed for grasping and manipulating objects. This limits their potential for developing advanced technology or complex problem-solving. Dogs, although intelligent, often rely on humans for problem-solving and lack the independence of wolves. The smartest dogs, like Lycus, which are adapted to their environment and solve problems independently, show remarkable autonomy. Raccoons are another potential candidate. They are partially arboreal, omnivorous, social, and have versatile hands. They live in diverse environments, from forests to urban areas. However, raccoons have also remained largely unchanged for millions of years. Their highly developed sense of smell and claws for climbing and grasping might have limited their evolution towards more advanced intelligence. That's a great point. Our ancestors also went through significant changes. In the Paleocene, they didn't have grasping hands either, but as they specialized as tree dwellers, they lost some of their sense of smell and developed better vision and hearing, eventually leading to speech. Raccoons, however, are climbers, not jumpers. They have short, stocky legs and lack the specialized joint for jumping like our ancestors did. Jumping from branch to branch helped our ancestors develop coordination and quick thinking. This also provided safety from predators. Raccoons climb trees but don't jump far distances, which makes them slower and less agile compared to monkeys. Raccoons rely heavily on their sense of smell. Their large noses and reliance on olfactory cues might limit their cognitive development. While it's theoretically possible for an intelligent species to evolve with a strong sense of smell, communication through gestures and sounds is much more efficient and allows for more complex information exchange. Imagine trying to convey complex concepts like calculus through sense. Drawing or speaking about it is much more practical. Raccoons' dependence on smell over vision and hearing, along with their clawed, climbing fingers, seems to have hindered their evolutionary path towards higher intelligence. Indeed, primates like capuchins, chimpanzees, or even gibbons are our closest relatives and the most likely candidates for evolving higher intelligence. However, as we've seen, their evolution often takes different directions. Chimpanzees, for example, develop knuckle walking, making it difficult for their hands to evolve into tools like ours. Their teeth have also become larger over time. Bonobos, or pygmy chimpanzees, are known to be more peaceful, but our ancestors were even more sociable and cooperative. The major challenge for any potential candidate today is the presence of humans. We are the ultimate competitors, occupying all ecological niches and dominating the planet. Intelligence requires a lot of energy and space, which humans have monopolized. Science fiction often imagines alternative intelligent beings, but they usually end up being variations of humans, perhaps with pointy ears or some animalistic features. Yet, imagining intelligent raccoons, advanced cephalopods, or even centaur-like beings derived from fish is far more intriguing and possible in an evolutionary context. Who knows what the future holds? Perhaps with advancements in genetic engineering, we might see some of these ideas come to life. In evolution, there's an interesting, if somewhat ironic, rule that the most advanced, remarkable progress often arises from the most primitive and insignificant beginnings. Highly specialized and advanced creatures tend to reach a peak where they no longer need to evolve further. They are perfectly adapted to their environment, with no need for drastic changes. Humans are unique in that our ancestors were relatively average and nondescript, constantly facing challenges that forced them to evolve. For example, take the platypus. It's a fascinating creature with a duck bill, laying eggs, possessing electroreception, and having a venomous spur on its leg. Despite these unique traits, it's highly specialized and unlikely to evolve further into something significantly different. Similarly, humans have lost certain features over time, such as tails, vibrissae, whiskers, and many teeth, reducing our potential for new evolutionary adaptations. In contrast, burrowing creatures like shrews, which have remained relatively unchanged for millions of years, demonstrate that significant evolution can still occur from these humble beginnings. Nevertheless, our next evolutionary stage might not be far off. This was the Curiosity Dude urging you to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you have insights into alternative intelligent beings or knowledge about reptilians and other humanoids. Share your thoughts and research, engage with friends and family, and inspire children to dream big and write imaginative stories. Together, let's push the boundaries of our understanding and creativity toward a bright future. Stay curious and keep exploring.
Welcome to the Curiosity Dude podcast. In today's episode, we're diving into the fascinating topic of migrations of ancient people. Where and why did our ancestors go? Globe showing Europe, Africa. We'll explore the reasons behind these epic journeys, the challenges our ancestors faced, and how their movements shaped the world we live in today. From the first steps out of Africa to the spread across continents, join us as we unravel the mysteries of ancient human migrations. If you enjoy our content, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us bring more curious content to you. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Let's get curious together. Today, we will talk about the migration of ancient humans, how they wandered around, and what resulted from it. The first question that always comes up is, why did they move in the first place? The answer is quite simple. They moved because they could, and because there was food available nearby. The main goal was to find resources as usual. The movement of ancient humans, much like modern humans, was essentially a random walk, similar to the movement of any living creatures. If there is a certain number of people, bacteria, fungi, or any other living beings in a given area, and there are resources available, they will eventually consume those resources. If there are similar resources nearby and no one else is there, they will move to that area. Since they moved mostly on foot and were in no hurry, they probably covered about 20 kilometers a day, but usually much less. As hunter-gatherers, they could cover longer distances, but not in a single day, maybe over a couple of days. They moved slowly and not in a straight line, but rather in a random manner. With each move, their lives didn't change much, but things got better because they had already consumed all the resources in one place and found new resources in another. So, they moved a bit further each time, and after about 100,000 years, they found themselves on the other side of the continent or even on a different continent altogether. So, this movement was generally random, driven by the gradient of population density, from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Interestingly, these migrations were very slow, and humans were not the fastest movers. If we look at the synchronous migrations of animals at the same time and in the same approximate places, many animals, even those not particularly fast, migrated much more actively than humans. Humans sometimes moved the slowest. Animals like ostriches, pigs, zebras, antelopes, and others moved much more energetically. So, in this sense, humans were not record holders. However, humans excelled in consuming all available resources. Perhaps this is why humans didn't move much for a long time, because they could eat almost anything. By staying in one place, they would consume different types of resources until there was nothing left. For example, a zebra eats grass, and once it's gone, it can't eat anything else and moves to the next patch of grass. But a human would eat antelopes, the same zebras, all the fish, then the grass, fruits, and everything else. So, one human could stay in one place for a longer time and have less need to move. Eventually, they would consume everything, including crayfish and bird eggs, and then move to the neighboring area. Another point is that although these movements were slow from our current perspective, they sometimes seem almost instantaneous. Our dating methods are just not that great. I mean, when we have an error margin of plus or minus, say 100,000 years for ancient times, like the era of some sharp stone tools, we just don't notice the migration. Over 100,000 years, or even plus or minus 5,000 years, we miss a lot. In 5,000 years, even if you walk 10 kilometers a day, that's 50,000 kilometers. You could walk around the Earth twice. So, when we look at this, It sometimes seems like people teleported. One moment they're here, the next dating shows them on the other side of the continent. But it's not because they teleported, it's because our dating methods aren't perfect, and we don't have that many sites. If we had all the sequential places they went, we'd see they walked like this, and like that, and like that. Plus, we should remember these migrations weren't just one group of travelers but entire populations. People often forget this when they think about why humans left Africa. People stayed in Africa and still live there today. It's not like they left Africa and then came back to repopulate it. They filled Africa, and as they multiplied, new people left Africa too. This applies to any territory, not just Africa. So, it wasn't one group of people walking from Africa to Australia or America. These were different people born in different centuries, with little in common. So, how did they move around? Well, it was pretty simple. Mostly they just walked everywhere. No fancy transportation, just good old-fashioned walking. That's why most migrations followed the same ecological zones and open plains that were our species' original habitats. You know, like when we climbed down from the trees and started living in the savanna. Wherever there was savanna, that's where we spread out. Early on, we weren't very adaptable and could only live in certain climates, so we stuck to those areas, like the southern edge of Eurasia. But as people became more diverse and biologically adapted to different environments and culture developed, they started moving north too. And let's not forget, if we're talking about ancient times, geography wasn't the same as it is now. Coastlines changed, land masses appeared and disappeared because sea levels fluctuated. These changes could happen pretty quickly, sometimes within a couple of generations. Imagine your great-grandparents walking on dry land, and by your time, it's all underwater. So, when people ended up in cold places, it didn't always mean they settled there because it was cold. They might have settled in a warm place that later turned cold because the climate changed. But sometimes they did settle in cold places too. Walking was the most basic way to get around, but eventually, people started inventing things. We have very few pieces of evidence about how they did this, but there are some hints. For example, there's a rock painting showing women carrying stuff on their backs. We know from ethnography that there are many ways to carry things: kids, baskets, food, on your back, chest, or under your arm. There's also a pathological case from Sungur, where a girl, or boy, according to geneticists, had significant wear on her neck vertebrae and collarbone, suggesting she carried heavy loads on her head, supported by her hand. This kind of wear and tear at such a young age indicates chronic pressure, which is unusual for children. So, this kid was probably carrying heavy stuff on her head, just like people in many parts of the world still do today. So, here's the only 100% reliable version of how it all went down. No doubt they also used some manual sleds or carts, but we have no traces of those. By the end of the Upper Paleolithic, dog sleds probably appeared. We found a bone artifact on Mount Ofontova that seems to be part of a dog sled. Similar elements are used in modern dog sleds. About 20,000 years ago, they might have used dogs for sledding. Reindeer sleds came much later, around the mid-Holocene, but mostly they just walked. Sometimes they swam, but we have no idea how they did it. Even monkeys swim to islands, and they still do it in Indonesia. Sulawesi, which was never connected to the mainland, has several endemic species. So, they must have swum there. And let's not forget about the monkeys. Humans, from Homo erectus to Neanderthals and modern humans, crossed sea straits. We see evidence of them on one shore and then suddenly on the other. They probably made some kind of boats. If they had a kilogram of brain, they could figure out how to hollow out a log and float on it. They had tools, hands, and functioning brains. If they hunted mammoths, they could definitely make a boat. Finding such a boat is nearly impossible, but they definitely swam across, sometimes in groups. They settled as families, not just individuals. migration started long before humans, with ancient primates and their relatives. At the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, the Adiposauriculae were quite the travelers. Adiposauriculae are a mysterious group that might not even be related to primates, but they share many features with primate ancestors. There's a hypothesis that they are indeed primate ancestors, but they are poorly studied. Despite finding quite a few specimens, there are only a few species and genera, and they haven't been extensively researched. Only a handful of articles exist, with just a few people studying them. However, from a paleogeographic perspective, they are fascinating. The oldest Adiposauriculae are known from India, with later ones found in Europe and North Africa. This is particularly interesting because, at the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, India was an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, separated from Africa and Eurasia. Europe was also separated from Asia, and what is now South Asia and the Middle East were archipelagos. Africa was well separated from Europe, and Europe from Asia and America. Despite this, Adiposauriculae managed to live in India, which raises the question of how their ancestors got there. Later, they somehow ended up in Belgium, which was also an archipelago, and then in North Africa, which was not exactly close by. But it wasn't just Adiposauriculae making these journeys. In the same faunus of India from the late Cretaceous, there were also snakes and other animals related to both African and Asian species. Faunal exchanges happened in ways we don't fully understand, as there were no large archipelagos between these regions. The connection between Asia and India is also a bit of a mystery, as India eventually collided with Asia, raising the Himalayas. We know this from oceanic deposits found in the Himalayas. There might have been other islands we don't know about because they were crushed, submerged, or otherwise lost to time. So, whether it happened or not, who knows? But anyway, Europe isn't exactly around the corner. Even if they somehow made it from India to Asia, which, by the way, they didn't, getting to Europe was a whole other adventure. Interestingly, they seem to be older in Europe than in Africa. You'd think it would make more sense for them to go from India to Africa and then to Europe, but nope, they took the scenic route. Adiposauriculae are a poorly studied group, so there's still a lot to discover. In Asia, the fauna is well studied, but no sign of these guys. And they're not in North America either, even though European and North American faunas are very similar. It's like they just skipped North America entirely. This shows that even ancient, seemingly tree-bound animals could migrate across continents. So, it's no surprise that humans did even more impressive migrations later on. These critters were probably similar to modern tree shrews, but with a bit of a possum mixed in. By the middle of the Eocene, lemurs and early monkeys were happily migrating all over the place, independently of each other. The Eocene was a climatic optimum, with lush tropical forests everywhere, making it a paradise for primates. These early primates spread out almost everywhere, except for Australia and Antarctica. They were living the good life in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So, in Africa, things were a bit different. Not too many deposits there, but still, they moved around quite energetically. Deep within these half-monkeys, right in the middle of the ocean, normal monkeys appear. These aren't half-monkeys anymore, they're full-on monkeys. And there's a whole mystery with their movements. Let's start with lemurs. As I mentioned, the original half-monkey group is mostly North American. That's where most discoveries are made. But nowadays, lemurs mainly live in Madagascar. Madagascar has been an island since the end of the Jurassic, beginning of the Cute period, Cretaceous. Between it and Africa lies the Mozambique Strait, which hasn't changed much over time. It just quickly drifted away. Unlike India, which kept moving north all this time, Madagascar was pretty much nailed down. Not too far but not too close either, Just enough distance to make getting there really tough because the currents here are super strong from north to south. If you start off from Africa, you'll probably get swept way down south. That's why Madagascar's flora and fauna are freakishly unique. The flora is less so since seeds can fly on the wind or get carried by water more or less okay. But fauna? Endemic with terrifying intensity. Insects, birds, you name it, and primates for sure. And lemurs? Definitely not swimmers. They hate water like cats hate vacuum cleaners. They only go near it for a drink. Nevertheless, how did they end up in Madagascar? Most likely from somewhere out of Africa? Or maybe Oman because the closest fossil relative to modern Malagasy lemurs was actually found in Oman, which was part of Africa back when this whole Middle East thing was still African territory before the Red Sea even existed. Maybe similar species lived further south during what we now call Mozambique times and somehow crossed over. Or maybe they actually started off on some coastlines and got carried by currents straight to Madagascar? Who knows? It's hard to guess now. Ideally, we do some research on similar layers in Mozambique, if any geological ones exist at all. I'm sure there are, but no one has studied them yet. So, it seems like Mozambican paleontology doesn't really exist as a field. But it would be cool if it did. In Africa, with such ancient history, there's still some stuff up north, but down south, practically nothing has been found. But they did manage to get there, and this actually saved the lemurs to a large extent. Later on, the average half-monkey went extinct almost everywhere, surviving only in Southeast Asia, a bit on the mainland and in Africa. In Europe, North America, and most of Asia, they disappeared because new predators and cool new competitors, like actual monkeys, showed up. Madagascar, however, was never settled by monkeys, except for humans who arrived in the Middle Ages, or maybe the Bronze Age at the latest. And, funnily enough, humans ended up wiping out most of the lemurs, but some still bring joy to everyone today. This was the first major oceanic migration of primates that we know of. There's also a big mystery with the first monkeys because the oldest known monkeys come from two opposite places. On one side, there's Southeast Asia, China, Thailand, Burma, where they found simians, like the lower jaw of a simian in Thailand and China. Not just them, but some 45,000-year-old teeth of anthrosimians in India, though not much is known about them. In later times, Asia had plenty of them, pandongs, Phipotecs, and a whole bunch of others. On the other hand, similar creatures lived in North Africa, Egypt, and what is now Libya. And speaking of fauna, North Africa and South Asia are still quite similar today, but they were even more alike in the recent past, until humans came along and messed everything up. Back then, they really shouldn't have been so similar because, as you can see on the map, there was this pretty hefty sea called Paratethys between Africa and Northern Asia. Crossing it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. The regions of today's Middle East, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India were like some kind of archipelagos where probably lots of mysterious shenanigans went down. But we don't know much about them because no one bothered to dig up those sediments. Basically, nobody ever really looked for anything in places like Afghanistan or Iran, the mighty Iran. There's probably stuff buried there waiting to be discovered. Plus, there are these mysterious combinations of ancientness and primitiveness. The oldest Asian species are found here while the most primitive ones pop up in North Africa. Ancientness and primitiveness aren't strict synonyms because sometimes we find bits from the past that suggest migration might have occurred from primitive states. We just haven't found the original source yet. But since our locations are limited, like eeny meeny miny mo, between North Africa and Southern Asia, we're left guessing what could have happened. It's possible that new variations of these monkeys actually arose somewhere in between because there's this theory that cool new groups emerge in odd places like islands due to isolation since isolation breeds all sorts of wild stuff which might evolve into something bigger, or most likely go extinct because these unique faunas can't compete, but sometimes over millions of years evolution works its magic creating new groups. On the other hand, it's quite possible that the wildest evolution happened somewhere in Central Africa. From there, they spread north across Africa and into Southeast Asia. But, of course, we have no data on Central Africa. A curious piece of evidence for this possibility is the discovery of parapithecid teeth, those ancient monkeys, in South America, in Peru, on the opposite side of South America. No one expected to find parapithecids there, but they did. So, from Southeast Asia, they somehow managed to get there. They couldn't have, but they did. And North Africa is also a mystery. But from Central and Western Africa, they probably could have. So, in fact, they couldn't have, but they did. This means they lived somewhere in both Western and Central Africa for sure. But again, we have no data. In Western Africa, our paleontology is practically zero. There's nothing. Yet, there are tons of species there now, including some really cool ones, but we know nothing about them. So, there was some unknown hotspot there. The fact that the range is split into two parts is a paleontological fact. And somehow, they still moved around because the groups are scattered. Meanwhile, some groups remained endemic. For example, there are Afrotarsius, found only in North Africa. No one found them in Asia. So, there are literally just two species, and they stayed only in North Africa and didn't make it to Asia. Well, Simes, early on, they were only in Asia, not in Africa. But some parapithecids were in both places, and those amphipithecids were also in both places. So, it's still a mystery how all this happened, but the Eurodudes were evolving. Later, in the Oligocene, the climate started getting worse. India finally crashed into Asia, messing up all the currents. Africa started slowly sticking to Eurasia, but the sea there became shallow. Future Mediterranean vibes were setting in, and Eurasia was coming together, but South America was still doing its own thing. And right around this time, at the border of the Eocene and Oligocene, monkeys arrived in South America. Apparently, they got there at least twice, maybe even 4 times. I already mentioned the parapithecids. There's a new find of them in South America. And the ancestors of flat-nosed monkeys also arrived there 3 times independently. There are some primates that are kinda flat-nosed and kinda not so flat-nosed in South America, but their worn-out, isolated teeth make them super mysterious right now with new exciting finds. So, around 26 million years ago, we start seeing full-fledged remains of what are definitely the ancestors of modern broad-nosed monkeys. Whether it was the second, third, or maybe even the 4th wave of settlers, who knows? But these guys were definitely more modern. Anyway, whatever wave it was, their ancestors were chilling in North Africa, like some kind of ancient Egyptian monkeys. At that time, there were no potential ancestors in North America, but their descendants ended up in South America. Now, getting from the old world to the new one was tricky. There were all sorts of wild theories, including one about traveling through Antarctica, which sounds pretty crazy for monkeys. But theoretically, it was possible during the Eocene epoch because the climate was such that tropical forests grew in Antarctica. There were all sorts of fauna there, although no one's found any actual evidence yet. I personally think they never made it there, but if they had, they would have been just fine. Marsupials and birds were there, and forests were growing. The real problem was figuring out how to get from Africa to Antarctica because the currents run horizontally, not vertically. And there was definitely a connection between South America and Australia through Antarctica. Marsupials made the trip, and there were lots of other creatures too. So, theoretically, you could travel from Africa through Europe or the Bering Strait into North America and then down to South America. Migrations happened all over the place, judging by various animals. There were migrations through the Atlantic, across archipelagos, and through the Bering Strait. At least, that's what it looks like from the variety of species in North America and Eurasia. Eurasia was very similar, with ancestors of horses and all sorts of other animals evolving and migrating around that time. The problem is that by this point in North America, primates had vanished. Like poof, gone. And just where they disappeared was right there at that time. I mean, maybe there were a couple of species hanging on by a thread, some oddball Amy's rodents or some obscure lemur, but by the time Oligocene rolled around, they were pretty much history. At the end of the Eocene or somewhere around that border zone, they were Genizo. And these Amy's guys were so specialized that they clearly couldn't have been ancestors to our snub-nosed friends. No way, Jose. Their leg bones had fused together like some kind of biological superglue and wouldn't unfuse if you begged them to. Plus, their dental system was so simplified it's like they were on a permanent liquid diet. So crossing through North America? Not an option, no monkeys to be found there. It's like they all got an invite to some exclusive party elsewhere. The local fauna has been studied 6 ways from Sunday. Researchers have done their homework, but nope, not a single monkey passed through. That leaves us with one wild card, hopping straight from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean, which back then was half its current size and had currents zipping along twice as fast thanks to straits between the Americas funneling them like water slides at an amusement park. In theory, you could have floated over on a log, especially since I mentioned earlier that it was getting cooler and drier, but everything's relative. Cooler and drier compared to what came before, but compared to today? It was practically sauna weather back then, with temperatures up 6 to 10 degrees warmer than now planet-wide. Africa was decked out in tropical forests, the kind where you find Egyptian Phaeum fossils where now there's just sand for days. And speaking of Phaeum, it used to be mangrove central along lagoon shores teeming with life where now you'd only find Sahara sands for company. So if Sahara looked like that back then, Central West Africa must have been a party. The Congo Basin was a beast, with forests and giant trees everywhere. For small primates like our Egyptian monkey friends, one tree could be home for weeks or even months. If a tree fell into a river and floated out to sea, those monkeys wouldn't have to panic. As long as they had leaves, fruits, and bugs to munch on, and if they got lucky with some rain filling up a hollow for fresh water, they could theoretically float to America in a couple of weeks. The odds? Tiny, but hey, it only had to happen once or twice. Once upon a time, a couple of monkeys made it across, and then another group did too, but not in sync, obviously. They weren't paddling on the same log, but hey, the odds weren't zero. After all, it wasn't just monkeys making these epic migrations, lots of creatures did it. Even reptiles who couldn't care less, just chilling in a hollow tree for weeks or months. Spiders too, though they're not exactly energetic. And let's not forget the hoatzins, which are basically chickens with flight issues. They couldn't fly across the Atlantic, but their fossil ancestors were in Africa, and now their descendants are in the Amazon. So, if these birds, which need more food than monkeys, could float across on a log, then monkeys definitely could. Over millions of years, with millions of trees floating out to sea, the chance of one log with live monkeys making it wasn't zero. And that's how they got there. Oh, and rodents too, around the same time. Ancestors of modern guinea pigs, capybaras, degus, and chinchillas also came from Africa. Their closest relatives are in Southeast Asia and Africa, but they ended up in America. Crossing the ocean from Asia would have been too much, so they must have floated over from Africa. Rodents can't go without food or water either, but they made it because the climate and currents were different back then. It was a massive migration, especially surprising since humans took so long to get to America. Humans, unlike monkeys, are big. A family of 10 monkeys can survive on a big log for a month, munching on leaves and whatever else is on the tree. But 20 humans on a log? No way. Although there are stories of boats crossing the ocean with a few people, usually swept away by storms or on purpose. But it was harder for humans. Anyway, that's ancient history. More recently, early Australopithecines from Africa migrated too. They were found in East Africa, mainly in Ethiopia and Chad, but who knows where else they roamed. Or take somewhere even further, like Mali, Burkina Faso, or the Ivory Coast. There just haven't been any studies there. I'm sure they lived much more widely in Central Africa, mainly because monkeys live there just fine now. They were probably in South Africa too, but there are no deposits or researchers looking into it. At least, they were somewhere around there. And as I mentioned earlier, they didn't really migrate much. They evolved, sure, but they didn't move around a lot because they're forest animals. If you look at the modern forest fauna of Africa, you'll see that most species have very small ranges. Take a map of African monkey ranges, for example. You'd think Central Africa is one big forest, right? Well, now it's pretty chopped up, but it used to be one big forest. So why don't these monkeys live from the Guinea coast all the way to Tanzania? Nope, they inhabit specific forests. On this mountain, with its unique microconditions and plants, lives one type of monkey. But on the next mountain over, that monkey doesn't live there because there's a 10-meter wide stream in between. And the monkey can't cross it because, well, it just doesn't care to. If the branches don't touch, it's not jumping from tree to tree, and that's that. No chance for the monkey to cross. Or if we talk about larger creatures like modern-day chimpanzees, they live on the north bank of the Congo River and only on the south bank of the Ubangi River. They haven't interacted for a couple of million years. The Congo River is an insurmountable barrier for chimpanzees, even though you might think they could just walk around it. After all, it starts somewhere, right? But no, it's impassable and they don't need to cross it. As I mentioned earlier, resources in the forest are more than enough for monkeys in a very small area. If there's a patch of forest with fruit trees on this mountain, that's enough for the monkeys for their entire lives. They spend 2 weeks on this tree, 2 weeks on that one, and 2 weeks on another. By the time a month is up, the fruits on the first tree are ripe again, and they can just go in circles without any problems. This results in these small, localized species. This applies not only to monkeys but also to antelopes. If you look at the range of forest antelopes, like tragelaphs, there aren't many species, but there are plenty of subspecies. These subspecies are scattered in small patches here and there, and they don't migrate far. Forest creatures don't like or want to move far. The same likely applied to early Australopithecines. These early hominids were forest creatures that started venturing into the savanna. This was the most interesting time when they began to venture out slowly but hadn't fully left the forest. They were just starting to develop their ability to move around, running to the next bush or tree and climbing back up. They had to do it gradually. Moreover, we have legs and arms, and from Sahelanthropus to Ardipithecus, we see that arboreal adaptations dominated over terrestrial ones, but terrestrial adaptations were slowly emerging. This inability to move quickly and far is actually quite remarkable because it gives hope of finding many new species. Currently, there aren't many known early Australopithecines: Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus, 2 species of Ardipithecus, and the Anamensis australopithecus. So, let's say 5 species. But that's a very small number of locations, and there's no doubt that as soon as they start looking more, they'll find another 10 to 20 species without any problems. At least, in slightly earlier times, around 15 million years ago, on just one island, Rusinga, there were about 10 species of humans in different layers. There were good deposits there, covered by volcanic ash, and if there were 10 species in one spot, why wouldn't there be more Australopithecines? However, the climate was getting worse, and savannas were gradually taking over. This was a time when more than 6 human-like species went extinct. So, 15 million years ago, on one Rusinga, there were 10 to 15 species, depending on how you count. But now, in this location, there's only one monkey species, and here, two primate species, colobus monkeys and these very Ardipithecines, and that's it. But judging by the fact that these colobus monkeys made up a third of the entire fauna, life for primates wasn't so bad. Colobus monkeys are also arboreal creatures, rarely coming down to the ground. If they make up 30% of the fauna, another 30% are forest antelopes, and the remaining third includes Ardipithecines. So, things weren't so bad, and they just sat in these little forests. But the forests were shrinking, and they had to move a little bit. They developed these abilities more during the time of the gracile Australopithecines. Again, there are some questions about whether we are observing this or if it was actually the case because, at this time, the range visibly expanded compared to previous times. Maybe it wasn't that the range expanded, but our knowledge expanded because these gracile Australopithecines were found in both East Africa and a bit in the north. But honestly, there's only one point there, not a whole strip, and they are also found in South Africa. But personally, I have no doubt that they lived in North Africa because the Sahara wasn't a desert yet, and they could have lived in West Africa too. Why wouldn't they? Some modern species live there, so why wouldn't Australopithecines exist there too? There are no finds in some intervals, but it's clear that they moved around somehow. Nevertheless, it's noteworthy that these gracile Australopithecines were also quite endemic. The main species is the Afar Australopithecus, but there are others like Burrell ghazali, Africanus, and various others. There are many species, and they differ from each other in small, not very significant details, which allow us to judge whether this is an ancestor or not. But in the intervals, some intermediate variants seem to be visible. For example, classic Afar Australopithecines are found in Ethiopia and Tanzania. Slightly later, but still seemingly Afar Australopithecines from South Kenya, they are somewhat similar to South African Africanus. Therefore, there is an opinion that the distribution of traits was not strictly by species, but rather a gradual, clinal distribution. So, the northern ones were different from the southern ones, and in between, there were some average ones, slowly changing. Nowadays, among African animals, such lines of variability are well known. Take baboons, for example. Here, the baboons are yellow, they're white, and in between, you get some mixed colors. Over here, they have thick manes, over there, not so much, and in between, you get some medium manes. There's a theory that maybe they interbreed, but another theory suggests that it's not that they formed separately and then started interbreeding, but rather that this gradation has always existed. Now, these ranges are breaking up because humans have settled everywhere, pushing these animals out, and they live in fragmented pieces. But for Australopithecus, no one was pushing them out. Moreover, the savannas were forming in a way similar to their current state, and Australopithecus could walk on two legs and get at least half of their food from the savanna. So, they slowly moved around, but there was still some endemism. Interestingly, no one has found Australopithecus outside Africa during this time, which was between 4 to 3 or 2.5 million years ago. Meanwhile, other African and Asian animals were happily running back and forth, like pigs, ostriches, baboons, leopards, buffaloes, elephants, rhinos, beavers, and many others. Even hippos, which are usually tied to swamps, were moving around. It's still unclear where hippos originated, but they lived from Africa to Java. Nowadays, they're strictly African, but they used to live all over South Asia, including Indonesia. There were different species, but some were not very different from each other. So, if even such seemingly non-migratory creatures like hippos, with their clumsy proportions, could move far, then it seems like Australopithecus was destined to do so too. Nope, they pretty much stayed in the same place. But again, it's possible we just haven't discovered everything yet. Personally, I'm more than sure that once they start properly exploring the fauna in places like Arabia, Kamchatka, Iran, and further into Waganistan, they'll find Australopithecus remains there. But that's just a hypothesis, not really based on anything solid. There are a couple of bone fragments from Pakistan that, based on dating and morphology, could potentially be Australopithecus. There's one article about them, but the fragments are so vague. Honestly, there's even some doubt whether they're primates at all. So, how many Australopithecus were there? Well, some, but probably primates. But there's almost nothing left of their teeth, just roots, a piece of jaw, and some kneecap, which I don't remember what it's about. There could have been other monkeys too. There were successful later Australopithecus, for example. So, no one has found Australopithecus outside Africa yet, and by default, they don't exist outside Africa. Maybe they did, but in any case, other animals are known from the same time in places like India, where the fauna has been well studied. We know about the connections of other animals from that time, like pigs, which had several migrations to and from Africa. Pigs are much more adaptable to closed habitats like bushes and forests, unlike Australopithecus. It's surprising, but they spread out across Africa. Their limited mobility was likely because they didn't live in open savannas. Sometimes they're depicted as wandering in endless grasslands, but in reality, such savannas didn't really exist back then. They got half their food from forests, so they lived in bushy areas, not open plains. These areas had small, crooked trees, not giant ones. For a creature about 1.5 meters tall, these trees weren't enough to climb and eat fruits. But they could still find food in these bushy areas with fruit trees and roots. So, they didn't need to migrate far. They slowly spread out and lived in Africa, at least 100% for sure. Back in the early days of Homo, our ancestors like Homo habilis, and even earlier, the Rudolfensis gang, were the first to spread out according to anthropology. Although, to be honest, their range didn't change much from Africa. It's the same story with Prinsfeldovsu, whoever that is, and even more so, we don't have any anthropological finds of these early Homo in North Africa. But guess what? We do have them in Georgia, which is nice. If we look at archaeology, the range is much wider. So, this is more of an anthropological tale, but archaeology shows us finds from North Africa, especially the Northwest, and from the Sahel zone and the Sahara too. Not too long ago, a couple of years back, they found a site in Erden dating back 2.4 million years. So, this was right on the route they must have taken to get to Georgia. Clearly, people had already spread across Africa, except maybe the central part where the chimpanzees were chilling in the forest. Plus, the entire Middle East up to Georgia was inhabited. And not just the Caucasus, but even further north to Daman and the area around the Don River, where there are also archaeological finds. But in Crimea, there's no archaeology or anthropology of such ancient times yet. So, it seems Crimea and the northern Black Sea coast weren't settled at that time, at least not until 2 million years ago, maybe a bit later. So, these Homo habilis and the earlier Rudolfensis folks, the Georgians, who were basically the same Rudolfensis, were slowly spreading out. Interestingly, in terms of their ecological abilities, they weren't much different from Australopithecus. Same body proportions, short legs, broad shoulders, basically the same Australopithecus, but now with brains and tools, and they started eating a lot more meat. Sometimes it's said that technological progress and a new diet allowed humans to leave Africa. This is written everywhere, even in textbooks and school materials. Well, personally, I have serious doubts about this. I mean, look at ostriches. The lack of technological progress never stopped them from spreading all the way to South America, where they still live, and in Australia, Africa, and all over Asia, even up to Mongolia and China. They were everywhere. So, ostriches managed to spread without any technological progress. They even made it to Australia way before humans did. Somehow, they did it even though they couldn't fly. No one really knows how, but they did. And what about those giant tortoises on the Galapagos Islands? They somehow ended up there and on the Seychelles and even in Australia. They lived everywhere until humans unfortunately wiped most of them out. But they managed to spread without any technological progress. So, it's strange to say that humans needed technological progress to spread. It seems like it wasn't about technological progress at all, but just how things happened. Sometimes, the ranges of animals are completely illogical. You might find a creature known from just 2 specimens caught in one spot, and no one has ever seen them anywhere else. Meanwhile, a very similar species lives all over the planet and is doing just fine. So, these ecological connections can be quite mysterious and not well understood. And it seems like it was the same back then. Plus, there's the factor of research luck. We have 5 skulls from Dmanisi, but if they hadn't started digging up that medieval castle, we might not have found anything at all. So, guess what? They just found another tooth, like literally just now. Not in Dmanisi, but still in Georgia, just a different spot. This tooth is as ancient as the ones in Dmanisi. Funny thing is, they might not have found Dmanisi at all if they hadn't been digging up a medieval castle. They stumbled upon some ancient fauna, started sorting through it, and bam! Found some human remains. In other places, it's all about the tools. In Daman, it's stone tools. In Rostov-on-Don, they didn't even find tools, just a camel bone with some scratches. Across North Africa in Erden, it's tools again. Without these tools, we wouldn't even know people were there. Australopithecines didn't have tools, so we don't see them. That's why I believe we'll find Australopithecines outside Africa eventually. Tools just preserve better. But hey, we found skulls and this new tooth, which is cool. It shows that human spread wasn't far. In places like India or Java, with such ancient history, no one's found anything yet. I searched for a long time, but it seems there were no habilis there. Their mobility skills were still pretty basic, even though the climate was favorable. In Georgia, the Caucasus, the Black Sea region, and Crimea, the climate was like Africa's. There were giant hyenas, antelopes, elephants, rhinos, and all sorts of African animals. Even giant 4-meter ostriches. Crazy, right? But there were also some non-tropical animals like bears and wolves, which had a bit of a northern vibe. Still, they were tropical in a way. Honestly, from an ecological standpoint, nothing really stopped people from moving around. They just didn't feel the need to. But then things sped up, probably because people switched to a meat diet. Meat gets eaten faster than plants, which grow back quickly. You eat some fruit, and in 3 days, new ones are ready. No big deal. But meat? It takes longer to grow, and sometimes it even tries to run away. If you start chasing animals with a spear, they just vanish into the mist. It's like modern Africa where animals in reserves don't even care about people. They barely move for cars. But where hunting is allowed, you might not see a single animal for days. Even birds are scarce because animals know those 2-legged creatures want to eat them. So, people started migrating to follow the hoofed animals. At first, it was a weak trend, but then it picked up. Suddenly, humans spread over huge areas. It's like I said, our dating errors are bigger than the speed of migration. Homo erectus and earlier hominins spread from Indonesia to Britain. They started looking more modern with long legs and short torsos, perfect for long-distance travel. This long-leggedness is a great adaptation. You can see it in animals too. Those in forests look different from those in the steppes. These early humans occupied the same ecological niches as before. No magical tech progress, just running around and the emergence of savannas. Up until this point, a lot of these areas were covered by dense tropical forests, which the savanna folks just couldn't get through. But then, savannization really took off, like, seriously far. If we're talking late stages here, that's like 400,000 years ago, we're already kicking off the beginning of the ice ages. Up north, things were getting chilly, and down south, proper open grassy plains were popping up. And on an open grassy plain, you can walk forever. Like, as far as the plain goes, you can go without a hitch. Nothing's stopping you from just physically relocating yourself. So then you've got roughly similar fauna popping up, the kind that migrates huge distances. And following this fauna, chasing after antelopes and zebras, you could run anywhere you fancy. It's telling that not only antelopes and zebras move around, but people too. Speaking of which, humans back then were still in Africa as ergasters, later evolving into erectus. And what's curious is that African, Asian, Chinese, and early European skulls don't differ much from each other. If we take a skull without any labels or notes saying from such and such cave, we'd never guess whether it's from Eritrea or Java Island. There's no method for it because they're practically identical. That's because human settlement happened so fast over hundreds of thousands of years that there wasn't time for any mega-specific traits to develop. From this point on, humans become this super widespread species settling across vast distances. Animals are either stenobionts or eurybionts. Stenobionts are those adapted to living in one specific place. Think modern pandas stuck in their bamboo forests, and then there are eurybionts who live wherever they want with total indifference, like modern wolves found everywhere from Africa to Europe to India to mountains to steppes, even deserts if there's some meat or even melons around. Humans became super eurybionts, but not quite super yet because, as I mentioned earlier, they were still only in tropical zones, not even venturing into subtropics yet. Actually, each one of them has its own fancy Latin name, something really clever, but these subspecies are distinguished quite arbitrarily. Right now, I'm on fire saying that we don't have solid morphological grounds for this. Honestly, if we have a skull and we don't know where it's from, we'd never guess if it's from Africa or Java. They really look alike. But time goes on. First, human abilities increase with movement, and second, morphology starts to change. The most striking example of such supermigration is the settlement of Flores by the ancestors of hobbits and the emergence of these very hobbits. The original Pithecanthropus, let's say the Sangiran ones living in Java, didn't need to sail since Java was part of the mainland back then. They arrived on foot through a chain of what are now islands but were then part of this Sundaland extension. They settled at its edge and then crossed 2 or 3 straits. Probably 3 considering how Sundaland's limbs reached Flores according to modern geographical reconstructions. These straits were about 20 to 30 kilometers wide, 26 at their narrowest point, a pretty decent distance actually. You could see land on a clear day somewhere on the horizon. Yes, birds fly there and all that jazz, a mountain peak sticking out, but still you can't quite reach those 20 kilometers just like that. Not to mention that this wasn't some diving record holder or anything, and yet an entire company had to make it so they could live there for hundreds of thousands more years to proliferate and reproduce, and yet they made it there 1,000,000 years ago. In Usage, there are tools from 1,000,000 years ago, and in Matamench there are parts, like lower jaws and teeth, dating back 850 to 650,000 years. In Liangbua, from 90 to 50,000 years ago, there's this skull that's 80,000 years old, which is kind of the final result. The settlement of Flores is remarkable for 2 reasons. First, they crossed sea straits 1,000,000 years ago, which is super cool. But on the flip side, they couldn't cross it again for the next 1,000,000 years, in either direction. These hobbits, the second remarkable point, had already transformed into a distinct species, showing no new influx of characters. So, they just sat there, not going anywhere. Such migrations were possible but extremely unlikely and very difficult. Not only was Flores settled at that time, but also Sulawesi, Another island without a land bridge to the nearest mainland. There are pigs on Sulawesi, and elephants used to be there too. Elephants swim pretty well, but pigs, not so much. Different pigs made it there twice, and macaques too. The fauna is a mix of Asian and Australian, with plenty of land. So, fauna and people arrived on both sides. On Luzon in the northern Philippines, part of the Philippines was connected to the mainland, but Luzon wasn't, so they had to swim there too. Some terrestrial animals made it, like deer, elephants, and pigs, and later, macaques and people. On Sulawesi, people are known only by their tools, while on Luzon, there are not so pretty fragments, but definitely people, and also a dwarf species. 1,000,000 years ago, people could cross sea straits, but very rarely. In the Mediterranean, there are traces of archaic human migrations to various islands, but those islands were closer. So here's the thing. On Crete, for example, they found these ancient tools that look pretty terrifying. But on the right side, the dating is all over the place, and it's unclear what they found on the surface of these tools. There are some unclassified monuments, but judging by the tools, they were probably made by some ancient humans. Now, how did they get there? Did they swim? It's a mystery. Maybe they had some kind of boats or rafts, but nobody knows for sure. There's even a hypothesis that the ancestors of these hobbits were carried to Flores by a tsunami. But come on, there are 3 straits to cross. What kind of mega tsunami was that supposed to be? It's a pretty weak theory. Imagine surfers riding logs on a tsunami, planning their trip to Lilliput. It's just too fantastic. Anyway, these ancient humans somehow made it. But the evidence shows that the chances of this happening were very slim. Still, people kept spreading out over the same territories. It's not like they were exploring new lands. They were just expanding within the same area. In the south, for example, they didn't need to swim. They could just walk. But what's interesting is the movement to the north. Around 500,000 to 130,000 years ago, the ice ages began, and the climate got much worse. Yet people stayed in the north. Life got harder, and if they were just animals, they would have had to adapt or migrate south, like many animals did. But humans moved north even though they hadn't developed any cold-resistant adaptations yet. Physically, they were still tropical creatures. They were in Africa, Europe, China, India, and Java, looking pretty similar everywhere. For example, they all had wide noses, regardless of the location. But they started to diversify a bit. If you took a skull, you might not be able to tell if it was from Africa or China, but there were some differences. That's why we have names like Rhodesiensis, Heidelbergensis, and so on. This northern expansion was likely due to technological progress. They started building more permanent shelters, which at least protected them from the wind if not the snow. And they began using fire regularly. Around 354,000 to 300,000 years ago, things started to heat up, literally. Our ancestors figured out how to keep themselves warm and got way more into hunting. Before, hunting was like, meh, let's catch something if we can, but now it was all about those epic group hunts for big, fancy herbivores. We're talking elephants, rhinos, deer, you name it. Suddenly, there were bones everywhere, and our protein intake skyrocketed. This also meant we could handle the cold much better. But let's not forget, most people lived in the south where it was warmer. Over time, populations started to spread out and evolve into unique forms. Take Normandy and India, for example. Skulls from these places don't look much different from African or European ones, but other bones, like clavicles, are tiny. This suggests we might be looking at some ancient pygmies. India, despite not being an island, was like an ecological island because of the Himalayas. Getting there was tough, and the climate was already modern-like. Deserts started forming between Western Asia and India, making it even more isolated. So, you get these unique pygmies and other quirky folks with strange skull features. In Asia, you had these Denisovans or their ancestors roaming around. By this time, they were spreading out quite a bit. African and European populations were also starting to show some differences. So, here's the deal. It's like an ecological migration happening here. They're moving into cold climate areas because the cold itself is shifting south, but people are heading north anyway. They're even moving to places with snow and some kind of winter, like modern southern Europe. Over time, during the lives of Neanderthals and their buddies like the Denisovans and other ancient folks, they settled these areas for 1 million years but lived there until about 50,000 years ago. These guys didn't move far geographically, but ecologically, they were like, hey, we're still here, but everything's different. It's like they moved to another continent without actually moving. Neanderthals, for example, got all stocky and barrel-shaped, adapting to the cold climate of the Ice Age. The Ice Age wasn't just one big freeze but a series of cold snaps, so people were constantly migrating and displacing each other. This is especially clear at sites like Hawamation and Jebel Sandman in Arabia, where you can see layers of habitation from 400,000 to 50,000 years ago. It's rare to find such a continuous record from ancient humans to modern ones. So, you had different tool cultures coming and going, like the Acheulean complex, then another Acheulean complex, and then Levallois techniques, which were like the Swiss army knives of the prehistoric world. These techniques moved from Africa to Arabia and then to Europe, showing that people were constantly on the move, back and forth between continents. So, back in the day, like way back, say 200 to 300,000 years ago, on the walls of the Middle East, you had these proto-humans hanging around. They were kind of like early versions of us, but not quite there yet. Think of them as the beta version of humans. Fast forward to about 100,000 years ago, and they started looking more like us, but still not fully human. In places like Skull, you had these guys mixing it up with Neanderthals. It's like a prehistoric party where everyone's invited. Over in Kafsa, things were a bit different. The Neanderthals there didn't really mix with the proto-humans. It's like they were the cool kids who kept to themselves. Then, around 55 to 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals made a comeback. In Ahmed, they had some human-like features, probably because they mingled with the proto-humans. Meanwhile, in Shanidar, you had these super Neanderthals who had never even seen a human. It's like they were living in their own little bubble. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone, and the humans were back in action, spreading out all over the place. This back-and-forth migration happened a lot, not just in the Middle East but in other places too. For example, in the Altai region, there were at least 2 waves of Neanderthals, each with their own unique traits. And don't even get me started on the Denisovans running around before and after the Neanderthals. It was like a prehistoric game of musical chairs. So, in Israel, it's convenient that they have, well, in some places, immigration wasn't really a thing because they were pretty isolated. Like, in some remote areas, people just settled down and stayed put. But, fun fact, even Neanderthals sometimes managed to travel by sea. There are a few islands near Greece where they found Neanderthal tools. These islands, like Zakynthos and Lefkada, aren't connected to the mainland, but Neanderthals lived there. They must have occasionally hopped over, despite the 20-kilometer straits. It didn't stop them from paddling back and forth, though they weren't exactly keen sailors. Then came the Cro-Magnons, who were much more into traveling. Their migrations weren't just biological but also cultural. We can see this from the stuff they moved around like seashells. This is especially well studied in France, where archaeologists did a great job. They found shells far from the sea, showing that people carried them over long distances. For example, in Kostianki, near Voronezh, they found seashells, even though the nearest sea is quite far. The Black Sea was closer, but it wasn't very accessible during the Ice Age. They also found exotic shells and amber, which is rare in nature. Interestingly, amber was found in one place but not used there. Instead, it was crafted into items hundreds of kilometers away, where it was more valuable because it wasn't just lying around. So, tracking these items helps us understand ancient trade and migration. For instance, black flint from Grimaldi in northern Italy was found in France, 200 to 300 kilometers away. For a hunter, that's not a big deal. They could cover that distance in a week. But the real question is, would they be allowed to cross into another group's territory? By then, territories were pretty well defined, and stepping out of your hunting grounds could get you into trouble. So, there weren't that many of these finds, which shows it wasn't super common. It was probably a means of exchange and had some value. People already had a sense of value, thinking, hey, this is some cool stuff we don't have. You could live just fine without fancy stuff, but having a black flint arrowhead or a plate was pretty cool. Obsidian is a great example, especially in Melanesia. Volcanoes don't move around, so obsidian can be traced back to its source by its chemical properties. Even 30,000 years ago, people were moving obsidian over hundreds of kilometers, often by sea. They even transported live animals. On the Admiralty Islands, they found bandicoots and cuscus that shouldn't naturally be there. People probably brought them over, maybe as pets or for some other reason. By this time, people were making sea voyages of 400 kilometers or more. They had decent boats, but most of their trips were within sight of land. They didn't have the sophisticated boats with outriggers until much later, like in the Bronze Age. Southern Melanesia wasn't settled until much later, and places like Madagascar remained uninhabited for a long time. People moved around not just to find food but also to hang out and explore. They ended up settling almost the entire planet, running into Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other mysterious folks along the way. So, I tried to compile some data not so much about migrations but about interbreeding. Modern geneticists are now reconstructing gene flows between different ancient species. Not long ago, these same geneticists were telling us fairy tales that there was no interbreeding at all. Then they started calculating unexpected percentages, but I didn't include those numbers because the methods vary a lot. It turns out that Homo sapiens mixed with Neanderthals several times, Neanderthals with Denisovans, Sapiens with Denisovans, and some unknown species with both Sapiens and Denisovans. And this happened quite a few times. But differentiation started happening, and these various populations emerged. The thing is, 50,000 years isn't enough time for new species like hobbits to appear. Hobbits took 200,000 years to evolve, and we only had 50,000. Nevertheless, sapiens broke out of Africa somewhere between 80,000 and 50,000 years ago. The exact numbers vary, but around 55,000 years ago is a good estimate. Then they spread to places that had never been inhabited before, like Australia, Tasmania, the Americas, Polynesia, and Madagascar. This was the triumph of migrations. Initially, all sapiens were tropical-looking, but as they spread, they started to differentiate, eventually forming modern races. One particularly interesting migration was from Sunda to Sahul. Most of Indonesia was connected to Sunda, while Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed Sahul. There were some hobbits hanging around on the way, but sapiens managed to cross the straits. There are two theories about how they did it, the northern route and the southern route. It's not that important which one they took, but they spread out. After reaching Sahul, no new people arrived for thousands of years. Even if there were new migrations, they were minimal. Someone did bring the dingo to Australia 4,000 years ago, which probably didn't swim there on its own. Someone also brought outrigger canoes and bows and arrows to northern Australia. By this time, the Torres Strait already existed, and even the small islands between New Guinea and Australia were almost insurmountable for sapiens. Before Europeans arrived, some Indonesians knew about Australia and went there to catch sea cucumbers, but they weren't in a hurry to settle. This shows that knowing about a land and having the technology to reach it doesn't guarantee mass migration. So, here's the deal. They knew there was a shore where you could sail in, catch some sea cucumbers, and even find those famous Macassar burials from Australia, way before Europeans, like before Columbus. But farming there? Nope, not happening. The Macassars were either fishing or farming, and some spear-wielding aborigines were around too. Catching sea cucumbers to sell to the Chinese? Sure, that's doable. But living there? No way. They were like, why bother? Our own islands are way nicer. For the Hiratka, it was fine, but still. So, having the ability and the need are two different things. America could have been settled in various ways. There was this wild hypothesis about African settlement from Africa, but it was super unlikely. People pointed to the so-called Negroid features of the Olmec stone heads, saying they looked similar. But those heads were actually a mix of a stern leader's face and jaguar features, which is undeniably cool. So, when you try to carve a 2-meter-wide stone face of your beloved leader to look like a jaguar, it somehow ends up looking like a black person. Technically, that's what happened. But there were no credible witnesses to such migration. There was also the Solutrean hypothesis from Europe. People said, look at the Solutrean points and Clovis points, they're almost the same. Plus, the oldest Clovis points are from America. But, first of all, that's typological, everything else is different. And secondly, during the Ice Age, the North Atlantic was just ice. How would they even move around? And between the latest Solutrean and the earliest Clovis, there's at least a 2,000-year gap. Where were they wandering for those 2,000 years in the ice-covered North Atlantic, where even seagulls couldn't migrate? So, it's extremely, extremely unlikely. There was even this bold hypothesis. What if there was a direct migration across the Pacific Ocean? Because let's face it, the skulls of modern Melanesians and the noggin of ancient Paleo-Indians from places like Lagoa Santa are eerily similar in many ways. We're talking broad noses, something for cranial features, you get the gist. But then you think about it, that would be some super direct migration. I mean, sure, Magellan did his thing, but that was totally in reverse. And let's not forget they offed him in the end. So here we have an almost too cool theory. If they started somewhere in Asia, or is it Melanesia? They'd have to cross the entire Pacific without leaving as much as a flip-flop behind. These guys would have to be super sailors or something. Then there's surviving coastal deserts like Peru on a no-rain for thousands of years diet, scaling mountains second only to Himalayas in height, and maybe even tougher, trekking through Amazonian jungles wilder than your craziest uncle, all to die out in Lagoa Santa without leaving any trace? They'd have to be super sailors, desert survivalists, rock climbers, jungle experts. It's hard to swallow. So perhaps the most plausible theory that checks out with everything is moving through Beringia because Asian anthropological features resemble those of American Indians. Cultures overlap quite a bit too. So yeah, probably happened just like that. And about Bering Strait migrations? Seems folks moved not so much with purpose but more like assorted groups who ended up together by chance, not matching on any parameters really. As far as we know now, there were at least 3 major migrations but actually lots of little bands doing their thing with 3 main components making up Native Americans. Proto-Mongoloids from China territory, Proto-Equatorials likely from further south, and some Proto-Uraloids from Siberia. Were they mixed along the way, in Siberia, Beringia, or already in America? Nobody knows for sure. We have very little data on Siberia and even less on early America. But judging by modern Native Americans, it was something like that. This is backed by anthropology, mythology, and even genetics. For example, DNA found in Malta and Fountain Grove is similar to that of North American inhabitants. Meet the culture buffs of Coves, the masterminds behind Coves culture. So, here's the deal. These genetic lines are pretty well rooted. Think of them as family trees with DNA. And guess what? Those Anzac folks have genetic variants similar to modern Far East inhabitants. We're talking Chinese, Japanese, and Native Americans, the contemporary kind. Meanwhile, over in eastern Siberia, they've got genes that are part European buffet and part Northwest Siberian smorgasbord with a sprinkle of Native American, up to 1/3 Native American by some accounts. It's like they all got together for a gene pool party. Now onto something truly epic, tracing these ancient migrations through mythology connections. Enter Yuri Bereskin. What a legend! This guy's an ethnographer-archaeologist extraordinaire who spent his life collecting myths like they were going out of style, which they're not. You can find his treasure trove online for free. Talk about open-source folklore. He's penned loads of hefty books that might double as doorstops but are chock full of smarts. He mapped out this mythological railway network, not literally railways but myth pathways, which coincidentally aligns almost perfectly with the spread of certain haplogroups. Here's where it gets wild. People tell myths that match their haplogroup. It's not like your genes force you to become a storyteller at campfires. It's more about how these storytelling circles traveled along with their gene-carrying members. And get this, men were the keepers and tellers of these tales while women were probably off doing something far more productive. In Malta? Yep, that place I mentioned earlier where they found this matching haplogroup, archaeologists dug up some mammoth ivory trinkets that fit right into this mythological narrative we've been chatting about. Whether or not those artifacts were gossiping about myths is still up for debate, but finding them on the men's side of an ancient dwelling is quite telling. So, here's the gist of the myth. In the beginning, there was water everywhere. All sorts of critters were swimming around, feeling a bit down. They started diving to the bottom, using their beaks, paws, and whatever else they had to grab bits of earth. Sometimes, in the extended version of the myth, there are unlucky divers and lucky divers. Anyway, some lucky ones managed to bring up pieces of earth, and voila, land was created. Interestingly, the little figurines are designed so that if you hang them, they point head down, like diving birds, not flying ones. This might be tied to the myth, but honestly, it could just be our imagination. However, the haplogroup matches, and the distribution area is the same. On the map, near Lake Baikal, these modern-day folks have the same haplogroups, and it all extends beautifully into North America. But you won't find this in the South, Africa, or Australia. There are some analogies in India, but they're a bit off. Like, why are the guitarists diving? But in South America, nope. Even in the southern part of North America, like Mexico, it's not really there. So, this is a prime example of how we see these migrations: genetic, cultural, and mythological. We know what they were talking about in their tents over 20,000 years ago. It's pretty cool, in my opinion, that we can reconstruct a myth from 20,000 years ago in such detail. Bereskin, being super cautious, never tried to write the original myth but compiled different versions. Some might say it's unscientific, but hey, it's possible to do such a reconstruction. Moreover, he cautiously shows that some myths actually record migrations not just from Eurasia to North America, but the first migrations of Homo sapiens from Africa, which happened 50,000 years ago or even earlier. These migrations can be traced through myths, and the oldest myth is about the origin of death. But that's another story. So, here's the gist of the myth. In the beginning, there was water everywhere. All sorts of critters were swimming around, feeling a bit down. They started diving to the bottom, using their beaks, paws, and whatever else they had to grab bits of earth. Sometimes, in the extended version of the myth, there are unlucky divers and lucky divers. Anyway, Some lucky ones managed to bring up pieces of earth, and voila, land was created. Interestingly, the little figurines are designed so that if you hang them, they point head down, like diving birds, not flying ones. This might be tied to the myth, but honestly, it could just be our imagination. However, the haplogroup matches, and the distribution area is the same. On the map, near Lake Baikal, these modern-day folks have the same haplogroups, and it all extends beautifully into North America. But you won't find this in the South, Africa, or Australia. There are some analogies in India, but they're a bit off. Like, why are the guitarists diving? But in South America, nope. Even in the southern part of North America, like Mexico, it's not really there. So, this is a prime example of how we see these migrations: genetic, cultural, and mythological. We know what they were talking about in their tents over 20,000 years ago. It's pretty cool, in my opinion, that we can reconstruct a myth from 20,000 years ago in such detail. Bereskin, being super cautious, never tried to write the original myth but compiled different versions. Some might say it's unscientific, but hey, it's possible to do such a reconstruction. Moreover, he cautiously shows that some myths actually record migrations not just from Eurasia to North America but the first migrations of Homo sapiens from Africa, which happened 50,000 years ago or even earlier. These migrations can be traced through myths, and the oldest myth is about the origin of death. But that's another story. So, about these migration capabilities, it's just amazing in my opinion. Around 28,000 years ago, give or take 1,000 years, there was the Dalny Vestinus site. They found a lot of stuff there, but the most fascinating to me is the Dalny Vestinus 35 bone, a fragment of a human femur. It's just a piece of the shaft, no ends, so not much can be deduced except that it belonged to a very large man. It's one of the biggest among all known Cro-Magnons. Only one other in Barma Grande might be bigger. This guy was huge. The thing is, this bone was found in Dalny Vestinus in the Czech Republic, but isotopic analysis showed that he ate marine food throughout his life. The nearest sea, the Adriatic, is 400 kilometers away as the crow flies, but you couldn't go straight because of the Alps and their glaciers. So he zigzagged his way there. Whether he came from the Adriatic or the Black Sea, he made the journey. In my opinion, this makes him the coolest traveler of all time. He traversed the entire known world of his time. To the south, there was just the sea, and to the north, it was too cold near the glaciers. He traveled from one end of the earth to the other. Sure, the world was smaller for him, but still, he covered as much ground as he could. Despite the glaciers to the west and the Balkans and Caucasus to the east, he managed to survive the journey. It's amazing that no one killed him along the way. Maybe they did in the end, who knows? But he managed to negotiate, find food, and keep going. Isotopic analysis shows he ate marine food, so he must have traveled quickly. The big question is, why did he go there? What was he looking for? Dalny Vestinus was a place where many people passed through. The culture there is known from Austria to almost Lake Baikal. The tools, figurines, and Venus statues found there are similar across this vast area. This shows that people moved a lot across the Eurasian steppe. This guy crossed several ecological zones, showing just how far ideas and people traveled back then. So, he traveled through the coastal zone. Then there were some coastal forests with moose and wild boars, then he climbed some mountains and finally reached the steppe. He somehow managed to adapt to new environments along the way, which were completely unfamiliar to him. Originally, he was a fisherman who had never seen a mammoth in his life, as they simply didn't live by the coast. But he ended up in a place littered with mammoth bones and tusks for kilometers. This guy was an epic traveler. It would be amazing to find his diary. Recently, a friend told me he's been writing a book about this. I've mentioned this in my lectures a few times, and people kept asking me to write about his journey. So, My friend took it upon himself to write it. I don't know what he'll come up with, but at least he started. Soon, we'll know the whole truth. This is a concrete example of a journey. What's remarkable about this compared to previous ones is that in the past, artifacts might have been found in India and passed hand to hand for 1,000 years. But here, we have a specific person. Someone suggested that maybe his bone was traded, but I doubt anyone would bother carrying a femur around to trade it from tribe to tribe. That's just nonsense. So, it seems he made the journey himself. Another example of such migration is the burial of a woman under a unique dolmen at Saint-Germain-la-Rivière. She had a beautiful necklace and an apron made of red deer canines. There were many different decorations, including 69 canines in one burial and 22 in the necklace. These canines are rare, so if 55 males with canines were found, the hunter must have killed around 500 deer to collect them. Plus, these deer lived about 200 kilometers to the south. So, here's the last example from Chauvet Cave, also known as Grotte Chauvet, which is much closer to us in time, only 15,000 years ago. These caves aren't exactly in the center of France, but considering the coastline was much further out back then, it's practically central. And there they found this chief's baton with what is quite obviously a whale tail drawn on it. Yep, you could doubt it for ages, but let's face it, it's most likely a whale tail. Moreover, at nearby sites like Istritz, there are actual whale bones. Not whole healthy ones, but all sorts of spear tips made from whale bones, even though the sea is more than 100 kilometers away. But then again, whales are such beasts that you can't just carry one over your shoulder in one go. So most likely these were tribes who roamed from the coast all the way into central France. And by shells, I've shown this before, it becomes clear, and by such artifacts too, so for hunters 100 kilometers isn't really a big deal at all. You could just wander around because when we see that humans have settled the entire planet, it's not so surprising anymore. I mean, if one person could walk 100 kilometers or even 300 kilometers during their lifetime without any trouble, then imagine what a population could do over thousands of years. They did it easily and casually. And from some point around the 16th century onwards, our planet was fully inhabited. Then came all these late great geographical discoveries like Madagascar being settled by Malagasy people, but that's another story endlessly worth talking about with its own nuances, like some specific little island someone sailed to on a boat. That part isn't as interesting as how we populated Earth, and now onto our next stage, settling space. So, Gagarin kind of paved the way, right? He said, "Let's go," and off we went. But where exactly are we going? That's still up in the air. Going back to the basics, why did we even go there in the first place? Now, about the moon, we can technically get there, we've done it before, but we don't go because, well, why? Spend a ton of resources just to leave a few footprints and bring back a rock? What's the point? Until we get a real urgent need for some element that's abundant on the moon, like cesium or something, we're not going. And for that, we need cold fusion, which we'll invent eventually. Or maybe when we mess up the planet enough, we'll find out there's plenty of fresh water in asteroids or comets, or all sorts of ores like iron, uranium, titanium, you name it. Then we'll rush there. But the question is, will Earth's resources be enough to get us there even once? Maybe we can haul some stuff back, but there might be plenty of resources out there, and some might be missing. No air to breathe, no energy sources, no oil, coal, or gas. No oxygen, just frozen water. How do you melt it? There's ice floating around in space, but what do you do with it? On Earth, you can melt it, but out there, the sun doesn't shine much. So, where do we go next? Well, there's still plenty to explore on Earth, like underwater. Our planet is 70% ocean, and we're not exactly comfortable there yet. Sure, many people love the ocean, but loving it doesn't mean we can live there. Maybe in the future, we will. Once we mess up the oceans, we'll head to Mars, Titan, or wherever. But that's for later. So, love to travel? Travel as much as you can. There aren't many unexplored places left on Earth, but you can always rediscover them. If Neanderthals could rediscover the Middle East 10 times, why can't you? So, go to different places, learn a lot of interesting things. Thanks for your attention.